Tractate Zevachim begins a new topic within tractates of the Gemara. The prior few all involved civil and monetary law, and the laws involving around court, crime, and punishment. From now until the second to last tractate, we'll all be dealing with the laws of the temple and its offerings. Now, of course, these are only relevant so long as the temple exists. There were two temples over different periods, the first built by King Solomon and destroyed by the Babylonians, and the second was rebuilt 70 years later, lasted for another few hundred years, and was destroyed by the Romans, as largely covered within Tractate Gittin. So, the discussions in this tractate and the remaining have little practical application nowadays, along with various laws of court and capital punishment, as discussed prior, and various laws of ritual purity and impurity, as discussed all throughout. However, God willing, the third temple will be rebuilt, and these laws of the temple and the offerings will resume their application. Before we begin, here's a very rough run-through on the different types of offerings brought in the temple, as illustrated by Scripture. The offered animal would either be an ox, sheep, or goat. First, there is the chatas offering, a sin offering brought to atone for a sin. There were two variants, the inner chatas, which had its blood applied on the indoors altar in the actual temple structure, and the normal outer chatas, burned on the outer courtyard altar like all the others. Then there was the ola offering, the burnt offering, brought in unique circumstances. There was the asham offering, a guilt offering, also to atone for specific sins. There's the shalomim, the peace offering, and then there's the toda, the thanksgiving offering. There's also a firstborn offering, the bechar, the tithe offerings, ma'aser, and the paschal offering, the korban pesach, although that was discussed more back in Tractate Pesachim. There's variation between each of these as to if it's voluntary or obligatory, which parts of the animals were offered, where the blood is thrown, which was a part of the service, who gets to eat the parts of the offering, and otherwise. But this is just a broad overview. There were also bird variations on the chatas and ola offerings, and additionally there was the flour and incense offerings, although that'll be more discussed in the following tractate, Tractate Menachos. Also, briefly, here's a brief order of the actual process of bringing the offering. The first stage would be simicha, leaning one's hands and confessing on the animal, which was done by certain sin offerings. Then went the blood service, which involves slaughtering the animal, receiving the blood in a vessel, carrying the blood to the altar, and then applying the blood to the altar. Then the sacrificial parts of the offerings were burnt on the altar, and then if parts of the offering were to be eaten, they'd be eaten. This process must be done with proper intents, which will be described, and the sources for all of this is listed within Scripture. Chapter 1 begins discussion on the proper methods of bringing temple offerings. The first Mishnah says, an offering must be slaughtered for its own sake. For instance, an ola offering must be slaughtered with intent that it be for an ola. A shlomim offering must be offered with intent that it be for a shlomim, etc. If this is not done, it's still a valid offering, although it won't count towards the owner as if he had brought it. The exceptions to this are the paschal offering, specifically on the day of its offering, the 14th of the month of Nisan, and the chatas offering, always, which would be invalidated if not slaughtered for their own sake. Others disagree. Rabbi Eliezer says included in this is also the asham offering. As similar to the chatas offering, it's also atoning for sin, so it's also invalid if not brought for its own sake. Others say that any offering at all, if slaughtered improperly with intent to be for the paschal or chatas offering, would be invalid. Others say if somebody slaughtered an offering for something with greater sanctity, it's valid, but if it was for lesser sanctity, it's invalid. So, kodshe kachim, offerings of greater holiness, if slaughtered as kodshe kalim, offerings of lesser holiness, are invalid, but vice versa, it would be valid. Similarly, a bechar or a ma'aser offering slaughtered as a shlomim would be valid, but vice versa would not be. The Gemara says, when it said that offerings not slaughtered for their own sake are valid, it then used the words, except that they don't count towards fulfilling the obligation. This is to express that they're only ineffective towards their owners, but they still retain their sanctity, so you can't continue to use them improperly. I quote the source for this opinion. It's asked, the implication is that as an offering slaughtered not for its own sake doesn't count, if it was slaughtered without any specific intent at all, it would be valid. However, this would be unlike a divorce document, which, if written without any specific intent, is invalid. It's explained this is because, unlike a divorce document, this can be offered for its own sake. It debates the source for this offering and rejecting a number of suggestions. It additionally argues proof that a divorce document without specific intent is invalid. It's asked, however, it said that an ola offering slaughtered for the sake of unconsecration, it's valid. Now, that would be unlike a divorce document where if written for the sake of a non-Jewish woman is invalid, in spite of it also being for a different category. So again, it's explained. The divorce document there specifically is just one written without specific intentions, which we said was invalid, while this offering was also one written without specific intentions, which we said by an offering is valid. It additionally argues this point from some laws of impurity. It's additionally discussed, quoting various sources on this topic. Further, it also quotes the scriptural source for the fact that the slaughter of an offering needs to be for its own sake, and it quotes individual ones for each of the different services of the offering involving the blood. The source that the offering must be brought for the sake of its owner is also mentioned. It further debates these and quotes further sources for the various parts of the offering process being required to do with the correct intent. Additionally, all this was specifically sourcing the shlamim offering, so it brings a verse that compares the other offerings to the shlamim, showing these principles also apply by the others. Anyways, it's asked, how is an offering brought with incorrect intent simultaneously a valid offering and not accepted towards the owner? So it said it's like an offering brought after the death of its owner, which is valid but doesn't fulfill anything towards him. Although that's specifically by an olah offering, and it debates the source for the other types of offerings, whether it can be learnt out from this or another source. For instance, the asham offering specifically is not brought after its owner's death. Additionally, I mentioned that specific usage of wording regarding the asham show that if the asham animal had been consigned to graze until it got a blemish and somebody slaughtered it without specific intent, it's valid as an olah offering. Anyways, it debates further. Heirs acquire the offering from their dead relatives, and evidently that's not the case based off of a few quoted situations. It is, however, qualified that while an inherited sacrifice cannot affect regular atonement for an heir, it can affect a peripheral atonement, meaning the heir can affect temura, which is the substitution of an offering. It's asked, does an offering brought with improper atonement affect atonement? It's debated, but it seems to imply not. Related, it asks if an olah offering atones for the violation of a positive commandment done after the offering's designation. As we know, a chatas does not. It debates this, and it's additionally argued on, citing quotes from various other discussions. Anyways, there's a debate if a toda offering, a thanksgiving offering, is valid if slaughtered for the sake of somebody else. On the one hand, it's still offered as a toda, but on the other hand, it's offered for somebody else, so it's considered separate. It's discussed some additional rulings, particularly from the sage Rava. A chatas offering slaughtered for the sake of another type of chatas is valid, but if offered for the sake of an olah is invalid, which is based on a verse. However, a chatas that's slaughtered for the sake of somebody else's chatas is invalid, while if it's slaughtered for the sake of somebody else who requires an olah, it's valid, as both of these men require atonement. However, if a chatas is slaughtered for the sake of somebody obligated to bring nothing, it's invalid, as just about everybody has at some point violated a positive commandment, which a chatas affects peripheral atonement for. It's also said if an olah is not slaughtered for its own sake, it's prohibited to throw the blood not for its own sake, which is based on a verse. Additionally, an olah that's brought after the death of its owner, it's invalid to slaughter it with intent to change holiness, but it's valid to have intent to change the owner. Others say actually the heir is the new owner. Additionally, it's said an olah offering is a gift, not for forgiveness, like a chatas offering is. Anyways, the Mishnah had stated that all the sacrifices are valid if slaughtered for the sake of another type of offering besides for the paschal offering and the chatas. The sources for this are cited and discussed for both the paschal offering and for the chatas offering. These are additionally discussed. Additionally, it's said that a paschal offering brought on its date on the holiday of Passover is only valid if brought for its own sake. However, the rest of the year, it's only valid if offered not for its own sake. The source for this is brought and discussed. A number of objections to this are brought and argued on further. The sources for the point that the residual paschal offering are considered to be like a shlamim offering are also additionally discussed. There are further points on this. Additionally, it's said that a chatas brought to atone for the consumption of forbidden fast that was instead slaughtered for the sake of having eaten blood or for idolatry. It's still valid, as they all have a similar status. It would be impermissible to slaughter it for the sake of a nazir's chatas or a mitzora's chatas, as these are akin to that of an olah. It's asked, what if the forbidden fast chatas offering was brought for the sake of contaminating the temple, which could possibly have the same status? It's debated and stands unresolved. Additionally, if somebody slaughtered something for its own sake properly, but with intent to throw the blood not for its own sake, it's a debate if this is valid. It's a debate as to whether somebody can have intents between different steps of the service. It's additionally discussed elsewhere, and it argues the point from a number of sources. Anyways, it has been stated that an asham is invalid if not offered for its own sake. It's argued if it actually can be offered like a chatas, as they're similar in a few respects, both being for atonement, but they're also different as they have their blood applied on different parts of the altar and similar. It additionally debates the comparisons between these two types of offerings. Related, it's learned that the same way some say specifically if the chatas offering has its blood brought into the temple sanctuary for atonement, it becomes invalid. The same applies to the asham offering as they're compared. Others debate this comparison, so it needs to source it from other discussions. Now, according to this opinion, that the chatas and asham offerings are equated to show that they're disqualified if not offered for their own sake. It's a question as to why then the mincha offering was compared to the chatas and asham offering. So that's explained explained to be to teach that if the Kohen is doing the mincha offering by hand, he uses his right hand, like by the chatas offering, and if he does it with a vessel, he could do it with his left hand, like an asham offering. Now, there is a differing opinion which disagrees that an asham and chatas are compared in regards to offering them for their own sake. Rather, they say that the comparison is that both of these offerings require simicha, the Kohen leaning his hands on the head of the offering. Similarly, there's a disagreement by the status of other offerings. By a paschal offering that's older than a year, so it's too old to be a paschal offering, slaughtered as a paschal offering on the 14th of Nisan, or other offerings slaughtered as the paschal offering in its specified time. There's a debate if that's valid or not. It's discussed. The latter opinion from the Mishnah held that an offering is valid if sacrificed with intent for one with greater sanctity, but is invalid if it was offered for the sake of one with lesser sanctity. The sources for this point are quoted. It's a debate if this refers to a valid offering, but one that just doesn't count for the owner, or if it does actually count for acceptance towards the owner. New Mishnah. If a paschal offering was slaughtered on the morning of the 14th of Nisan, as opposed to when it needs to be offered, which is in the afternoon, but it was not slaughtered for its own sake, some say we consider it as if it had been offered on the 13th of Nisan, so it's a valid offering of a different sort. Others say we consider it as if it was offered in the afternoon of the 14th, making it an invalid paschal offering. There's a quoted tradition that by all offerings which are eaten, if they're not slaughtered for their own sake, they're valid, but they don't fulfill an obligation for the owner. They would, however, be completely invalid if they were a paschal or chatas offering. Anyways, the point excludes the ola offering, which is not eaten, but others disagreed with this entire tradition. The Gemara explains, regarding the debate on a paschal offering brought with improper intent on the morning of the 14th of Nisan, the opinion that said it's invalid is that he held the whole day as the proper time to slaughter the offering. It discusses a case where there's improper intent, even though evidently the same debate if the offering is valid would apply with or without that, to show they maintain their opinions in both cases. It debates the source for the opinion that the paschal offering can be brought all day, quoting a few sources and the unique usage of certain words referencing the afternoon. This is additionally discussed. Some related quoted teachings, some holds that living animals can become permanently disqualified from the altar, and also that rejection of the offering from the initial consecration is considered a full rejection. Additionally, permanent rejection is possible as something that has only monetary sanctity. Similarly, it said if a person committed a sin, eating forbidden fats, for instance, and then designated a chatas offering for atonement, and then the man converts to a different religion, and then converts back, his offering retains its disqualification from the period he was converted in. A similar ruling is quoted, where a person designated a chatas offering and then became temporarily insane, and then became sane again. The offering retains its disqualification. Both of these were stated, as both are unique. By conversion, the person is doing it by himself, and by insanity, it's not within his power to return to normalcy. There's a similar question asked if somebody designated a chatas offering for having eaten forbidden fats, and then the court ruled forbidden fats to be permitted, and then retracted this ruling if the chatas offering is rejected or not. Anyways, the latter opinion, that only the ola offering is disqualified when its service is done for the sake of a different offering, is sourced. New Mishnah. If somebody slaughtered a paschal or a chatas offering not for their own sake, or received their blood or brought or threw it on the altar not for its own sake, or they started any of these steps with the proper intents, and then switched to the proper intents, or started with improper intents and switched to proper intents, in all these cases the offering is invalid. An example of starting with proper intents and switching to improper intents would be if somebody started bringing a paschal offering as a paschal offering and then switched their intent to be for a shalomim offering, or if the inverse is done, that would similarly be invalid. Essentially, this opinion holds that an offering can be made invalid during the slaughter, the receiving of the blood, the bringing of the blood, and the throwing of the blood. Others disagreed and say the offering would still be valid if the blood was brought with improper intents, as that's not strictly a necessary step of the process. Others are a bit more particular and say if the blood is brought somewhere where the Kohen must walk with improper intents, it's invalid, but if he was walking somewhere where walking was not necessary, improper intents wouldn't invalidate the offering. The Gemara quotes and discusses a few sources for these principles. It debates further principles of proper intents as to which precise steps of the offering process must be done with intent for the correct offering, particularly regarding the topic of pigul, essentially an offering made invalid through proper intent, such as for the wrong time. For instance, some say if somebody dipped their finger into the blood of an offering with improper intent, that could then cause its use as an inner chatas to become pigul and invalid. Others debate this and it argues a few sources. It's explained that those that disagree, saying dipping a finger into blood cannot affect pigul, are referencing outer chatas offerings. Anyways, one of the later opinions of our Mishnah stated that bringing the blood of a temple offering with incorrect intent won't make it invalid. The exception to this is for the inner chatas offering, where such an act would invalidate it, as carrying the blood is an essential step of that process. The source for this principle is quoted. It's also debated if generally the carrying of the blood can be done by a non-Kohen. It's additionally debated, although many opinions seem to state that it must be done by a Kohen. Additionally, it's asked, can the blood be brought to the altar not through carrying by walking, but by passing it between a number of different individuals? It's debated. The principle is additionally discussed. Another question, if a non-Kohen brought the blood, and then a regular Kohen walked it back to its original spot and then returned it. It's a debate if this is valid as to whether rectifying the act is permissible here. Similarly, if a Kohen brought the blood and then a non-Kohen walked the blood back and forth, there's a debate if this is valid or not. Others say in this latter case it would be invalid either way, as taking the blood back here would be a significant act, but this is disproven from a related quote. And that's the end of Chapter 1. Chapter 2 of Tractate Zevachim continues on the laws of temple offerings, particularly on principles of offering or consuming them with improper intent. The first Mishnah says, any offering whose blood was received by a non-Kohen, or a mourner, or somebody impure who had only just immersed on that day and hadn't waited for the day to end like you're supposed to, or somebody lacking atonement, or somebody not wearing the priestly garment, or somebody who hadn't washed their hands or feet, or somebody who's not circumcised, or somebody who's impure, or by somebody who is sitting or standing on utensils or on an animal or on somebody else's feet, this receiving of the blood is invalid. It's a debate if this step is valid or not if done with one's left hand. The Gemara cites scriptural sources for each of these various actions, showing how they're prohibited while performing the service. There's a debate by several of these as to where exactly their source is. It's mostly arguing as to where we know the offering service of a non-Kohen is considered to be invalid. It also quotes how we know a mourner cannot perform this offering service, suggesting a number of options and debating them. Although it is said this mourner only invalidates a service by a private offering, by a communal offering it would be valid, although others disagree. It quotes sources for the invalidation of the service of somebody impure who immersed but the day hasn't yet ended. It discusses this, and scriptural sources for the invalidation of the service if done by somebody not wearing the priestly garments are quoted. A related topic is discussed going through the proper methods of wearing the priestly garments. It said they couldn't be too long in that they'd drag on the ground, or too short in that they'd be held up in the air. They also couldn't be old or worn out, although if they were all these, the service would still be valid. However, if the Kohen wore 2 pants, 2 belts, or was missing any of the garments, or was wearing one too many, or had a cast over a wound underneath one of the garments, or if any of the garments were filthy or torn, the service would be invalidated. Some said that actually, if the garments were too short and were suspended, the service was actually invalid, although it's specifically when they were too small to begin with and not shortened by a belt. Some say the service is even invalid if the garments are too short or too long, and they're only valid if the garment was too long and was raised to a proper height with a belt. It tries to source this apparent debate. Related, it said the priestly garments must be made of linen and must be new and made of twisted 6-fold thread. Additionally, non-consecrated garments cannot be worn alongside them. There's debate as to which of these listed requirements are essential or non-essential. There are related points. It said a Kohen who is wounded on Shabbos can wrap reed grass around it only in the temple, although if it was done to press blood out of the wound, it can't be done anywhere. Reed grass must be used as a small belt would constitute in addition to the priestly garments. Others disagree and say there's not even an issue of it causing interposition in the service, either in this case as it's on the left hand or it's on the back of his finger or similar. Evidently, there's a debate as to how much constitutes an interposition. He apparently says a patch at a minimum of 3 finger breadths by 3 finger breadths, while others say even a single thread can create an interposition. It additionally discusses this argument. It asks on a number of different things that could possibly create an interposition. Wind blowing into a garment, a live louse, could dust be an interposition possibly? What about the space between his underarm and sleeve? Can the Kohen's own hand create an interposition if stuck into the garment? Can a hanging thread create an interposition? Can the Kohen's hair create an interposition? And does tefillin create an interposition? It's that specifically the tefillin on the arm create an interposition, which is based on a verse. Anyways, it brings sources that somebody lacking atonement and somebody with unwashed hands and feet invalidate the offering service. It said elsewhere that by the Yom Kippur service, the hand and feet washing in the morning is strictly necessary, but the washings in between services and garment changes are not. It brings sources for this. The way the washing was done was that the Kohen would place his right hand on his right foot and his left hand on his left foot and wash them like that. Others say that the Kohen should place his feet on top of each other and his hands on top of each other on top of his feet while being held steady by another man so he wouldn't just fall over. The verses imply the washing must be done while standing. Anyways, it said that if the Kohen washed during the day, he doesn't need to do so by night. But if he washed by night, he must also do so by day. Others disagree and say he wouldn't need to redo it, and this is discussed further quoting various relevant verses. Based on this debate, there's a related discussion as to if the waters of the kior become impure if left overnight. It's debated, although it is ruled that if a Kohen washes his hands and feet to prepare to remove the ashes from the altar, he doesn't need to rewash them after daybreak, as he'd already done so earlier for the day. It's a debate as to who this is in accordance with. Similarly, there's a discussion as to whether leaving the temple courtyard makes rewashing necessary. This is also debated, quoting many various discussions. It's also asked whether impurity is effective in requiring the rewashing of hands and feet, as discussed. It's also asked if the Kohanim could sanctify their hands and feet by placing them directly into the kior. It's a debate which branches into a broader point, as some hold that if the kior was unimmersed at sunset, or after, the waters within cannot be used by a Kohen for the offering blood or flower services, but they can be used to sanctify a Kohen to offer the limbs on the altar, although if the kior remains unimmersed by daybreak, its waters cannot even be used for that. Others disagree and say that there's only invalidation for services at daybreak if the kior went unimmersed. Others say that once the kior is immersed by sunset, it has to be left that way until daybreak. Some clarify this to say that it could still nevertheless be used for the night services. It debates between these opinions as to how exactly the kior was immersed. It's mentioned that they had this pulley contraption that could lower the kior overnight and was loud enough to be heard by everybody, although it was also announced by one of the Kohanim so everybody would know to start the daily services. Some say that a non-sacred vessel cannot be used for the sanctification, and it argues the source for this, quoting a few verses. Related, it's ruled that any substance that can be used to fill up the minimum necessary amount of a mikvah, being snow, ice, liquid mud, or otherwise, could also complete the necessary minimum amount of water in the kior, but cannot be used to complete the necessary minimums for washing one's hands in the morning. There are related points. It's also said that mikvah water can be validly used as sanctified kior water. It's actually a debate as to what type of water can be used in the kior. Some say it must be spring, meaning living waters. Others say it could be any water. Anyways, it brings the sources that an uncircumcised individual cannot participate in the offering services without disqualifying them. This is said to apply both to a physical lack of circumcision and also a spiritual lack, somebody with some spiritual flaw. It also brings sources for the point that somebody impure cannot perform the offering services. Some actually held it was permissible to slaughter and throw the blood of the paschal offering on behalf of somebody impure from a sheretz creature, but others argue with this. Some even bring support for the notion that bringing a paschal offering on behalf of somebody who's impure from a corpse is invalid. Again, that's disputed, although there's variation. Anyways, the source for the principle that performing the offering service while sitting is prohibited is brought. It explains that the punishment for doing so cannot be learned from other ways of improperly performing offerings due to the specifications of the verse. Also, the source for the prohibition against performing the offering service while standing on utensils or an animal or on another person's feet, that's invalid, is brought essentially as there can be no interposition between the Kohen performing the service and the temple floors. A utensil is listed as it's not a type of flesh, an animal is listed as it's not a human, and a foot is listed to show that's included as an interposition for another person. It's said if a Kohen is standing with one foot on the floor and one foot on the utensil, essentially the principle is that if the utensil were to be removed, if the Kohen could continue doing the service as he was standing, it's valid, otherwise not. If the Kohen was standing on a loose tile of the temple floor, one that was intended to be reattached, it debates if this constitutes as an interposition based on where the sanctification of the temple floor extends to. It's unresolved. There was a debate if it's valid or not to perform the temple service with one's left hand, which I'd find sources for both opinions. Others actually hold that the reception of the blood cannot be done with the left hand, but the application of the blood to the altar can be done with the left hand. It's a debate based on the specific usage of words within a few verses as to whether they imply specifically like the right hand. That's discussed. New Mishnah. If the blood from the animal offering spilled on the floor and the Kohen gathered it back up, it's invalid. The Gemara brings and discusses sources that the blood must be received directly into a vessel. It said that all of the blood must be received and also that the knife should be lifted so the blood on the knife also enters the bowl and then the blade should be wiped on the rim of the bowl. It's also said that the main blood vessels of the animal should be included into the bowl. There's a debate based on some other cases if the blood enters the airspace of the bowl and then the bottom of the bowl fell out as to whether it's considered as if the blood entered the bowl. It seems to prove from related cases by collecting water in a jug that once it enters the airspace of the jug, it's considered to have been received. This is additionally discussed. If, after the animal was slaughtered, the ear of the animal was slightly cut and then the blood was received, it's said to be invalid as it received a disqualifying blemish in between, so its status is changed. This is debated, and based on this, some explain that if an animal is slaughtered at basically exactly a year since its birth and then has its blood received a few hours later, it's invalid as it aged to 2 years old. In the meanwhile, related, some say if an offering is mostly in the temple courtyard but its legs are outside and one of the outside legs are cut off and then it's slaughtered, it's still valid. But if it was slaughtered, then a leg was mostly cut off, although not to the bone, and then the blood was received, it's invalid. It's an argument as to what can be learned from this. Possibly not that blood within limbs is considered to be blood, as it's possibly invalid due to the fat within the leg, and it possibly cannot be that kache kalim offerings of lesser holiness that went outside the temple courtyard before the throwing of the blood are invalid, as the case could possibly be referring to kache kachim, offerings of greater holiness. There's related discussion on these two variants of offerings. There are related cases brought. It said if an offering is inside the courtyard and its legs are outside, it said that it can only be slaughtered once it's fully in the courtyard. Additionally, the offering cannot be suspended in the air as it's slaughtered, as this must be done at the side of the altar. Also, the slaughterer himself cannot be suspended in the air for the same reason. He also cannot be suspended while receiving the blood, but the animal can be. Others disagree and say if it's a kache kachim offering, All those listed cases are invalid, besides for when the person was suspended as he slaughtered, and if it was a kache kalim offering, all are valid besides for when the man was suspended as he received the blood. Others disagree still and say that between kache kachim and kache kalim offerings, all of these cases are valid besides for where the animal was suspended as it was slaughtered by the kache kachim alone, and where the Kohen was suspended as he received the blood by both types. Also, if the Kohen's hair is outside the courtyard, it's said to still be invalid. He needs to be fully inside. New Mishnah. If the Kohen improperly applied the blood to the ramp of the altar, or somewhere not opposite the base, or on the wrong side of the altar line, or in the wrong location, indoors instead, it's invalid, but there's no punishment of karis, which is divine punishment. The Gemara clarifies the meat of such an offering is invalid to be eaten, but the owner of the offering still receives atonement. The reason for this is that the relevant verse implies that once the blood of an offering reaches any part of the altar, it causes atonement. It debates this from other discussions, and based on this, it argues if the person offering the blood was disqualified from doing so or not. It explains to be saying that if a disqualified person slaughtered the offering as opposed to throwing the blood, a qualified person cannot repeat this. The implication from these cases is that from the reception of the blood onwards in an offering, the improper intent of a disqualified person won't invalidate the offering in accordance with one opinion. There are other questions. For instance, it said that the throwing of blood that would not permit meat for consumption cannot cause an offering to be disqualified if it is done with improper intent. Others argue with this concept. Others explain our Mishnah actually to be saying that a blood offering brought in its incorrect place is literally invalid, and it's not affecting atonement, as it was done with a statement which, as it's an incorrect statement, would invalidate it. Another explanation is that the Kohen applied the blood in silence, and actually a blood application in its incorrect place does not count if that's the circumstance. It's just that when it says that the service can be repeated, that's when there's still blood coming from the animal's neck, versus here, where it just says it's invalid, that's where there's no more blood coming out. It further debates these opinions. It tries to find sources for this latter view. Some say that the inner altar actually sanctifies invalid offerings placed on it, and are argues as to what the source for this is. New Mishnah. If somebody slaughtered an offering with intent to improperly throw the blood or part of the blood outside its said area, or to burn its sacrificial parts or parts of the sacrificial parts outside its said area, or to eat its meat or part of its meat or tail at the minimum size of an olive outside its set area, it's invalid, but there's, again, no penalty of kares, divine punishment. If the intent was to throw the blood, burn the sacrificial parts, or eat the meat the following day, that would be pigul, in violation of improper intent, and there's a liability for kares, which is divine punishment. The Gemara says, this seemingly means that the hide of the tail has the same status as the tail itself, but then there's an issue, as we stated, that if somebody intends to eat the tail hide with improper intent, it's invalid, but if somebody offers a sheep whose tail is supposed to be burnt on the altar, and has improper intent to eat it, that shouldn't invalidate the offering, so it's debated, and some simply answer that the hide of the tail does not have the same status as the tail itself by these laws. He bases this on a verse. Some actually suggest that the hide of the tail is like the tail. It's just that when the Mishnah discusses this, that having improper intent by the tail hide is invalid refers to a goat's tail, which cannot be eaten. It also explains why each opinion takes issue with the logic of the others, and it disputes these opinions from some quoted cases. Anyways, it was stated that if somebody slaughters an animal with intent to consume it outside its proper place, it's invalid, but there's no divine punishment of kares. The scriptural sources for this concept are quoted. These are additionally discussed, debating as to which verses exactly are the source and going through a number of possible options. It's additionally discussed, and there are some further points. New Mishnah. The rule is, if somebody slaughters the offering or receives, carries, or throws the blood with intent to eat something that is actually meant to be eaten, or to burn something that is meant to be burned, with intent on a piece at least the size of an olive's volume, but the intent was to do this burning or eating in its improper location, the offering is invalid, but there's no divine punishment of kares. If his intent was to eat or burn in an improper time, it's pigul, a violation of improper intent, and there is a liability of kares, assuming the blood service was done properly. Regarding doing the blood service properly, it said if somebody slaughters in silence with no validating intent, and then did the blood service, receiving, carrying, or throwing the blood in the wrong time, or he slaughtered in the wrong time, but did the blood service with no intent, or he slaughtered and did the blood service all at the wrong time, in these cases, the blood service has still been offered as required. However, if somebody slaughtered in the incorrect location and did the blood service in the wrong time, or did the slaughtering in the wrong time and did the blood service in the wrong place, or he slaughtered and did the blood service all in the wrong place, or by a paschal or chatas offering, he slaughtered not for its own sake and did the blood service at the wrong time, or he slaughtered in the wrong time and did the blood service not for its own sake, or he slaughtered and did the blood service all not for its own sake, in all these cases the blood service was not offered as required. Additionally, if somebody intended to eat an olive's volume of the offering outside its place and then intended to consume it the next day, or he intended to consume the olive volume the next day and then intended to consume it outside its place, or he intended to eat half an olive volume outside and then half an olive volume the next day, or he intended for half the volume the next day and then for a half to be eaten outside, the offering is invalid, but there's no penalty of karas. There's a dispute. Rabbi Yehuda says, whenever the intent of time precedes the intent of place, the offering is pigul and there's a liability of karas. If the intent of place goes before the intent of time, the offering is invalid, but there's no karas. The sages disagree and say either way the offering is invalid and there's no karas. It is, however, agreed if somebody intends to eat half an olive volume and to burn half an olive volume with improper time or place, the offering is still valid as eating and burning do not combine. The Gemara says regarding the debate between Rabbi Yehuda and the sages, that's explained to be dealing with two services, and if they're dealing with one service, it's agreed there's no pigul as it's a combination of intents. Others disagree and say the dispute applies even within one service. It debates between these opinions going through a number of cases. It also further discusses this argument as to whether an initial improper intent of time precedes the improper intent of location, if that has primacy over the other. There are a few particularly discussed cases involving intent for half an olive's volume with intent for improper time and half an olive's volume with intent for improper location. They're discussed further, and it debates sources for the opinions as to whether or not it's considered a combination of intents. It's also said if somebody intends for dogs to consume an olive's volume of an offering the next day based on a verse, it's considered to be pigul in violation of improper intent. That's qualified. It's also asked, what's the status if somebody intended to have an olive's volume brought in an improper time or place to be eaten by two different people? It's a debate as to whether the amount goes by the intent, which is a full olive volume and would be disqualified, or by those consuming it, which is less than the minimum volume. It says it would still be invalidated, and it's then also debated if somebody intends to eat an olive volume of an offering in an improper time or location, but over a very long course of time, longer than it takes to eat a paras. It's a debate. Lastly, it was said that if somebody intended to eat half an olive's volume and to burn half an olive's volume, it's valid as eating and burning don't combine. This would imply that if both intents were to eat the parts of the offering, even if one part shouldn't be eaten, they would combine to invalidate the offering. This is argued, and it's explained that it specified eating and burning don't combine, as those things individually are things that are typically done, so it had to specify that they don't combine. And that's the end of chapter 2. Chapter 3 of Tractate Zevachim continues covering laws of temple offerings. The first Mishnah says, if somebody's disqualified from performing a temple offering for reasons listed at the beginning of chapter 2, this prohibition would apply to the service of receiving the blood, but they'd still be allowed to slaughter the offering, as most people are generally allowed to slaughter an offering for the temple, whether they're not a Kohen, whether they're a woman, a slave, an impure person. Even if the offering has the holier status of kachim offerings, they can slaughter the animal, although an impure person still can't touch the meat. So a disqualified person can invalidate an offering through slaughter by having improper thoughts. If a disqualified person received the blood with improper intents, whether to do it in the wrong time or place, if there's still arterial blood coming from the neck of the animal, somebody else can properly re-receive the blood. If somebody who is properly qualified received the blood and then handed it to a disqualified person, he can then validly hand it to a qualified person who can continue. If somebody received the blood with their right hand and then they put the vessel in their left hand, which is not permitted, they can then just put it back in their right hand. Or if they used a sacred vessel, poured the blood into a non-sacred vessel, they can just pour it back into the sacred vessel. If blood spilled on the floor, they can just regather it. If somebody mistakenly applied blood to the altar ramp instead of the actual altar, or otherwise in the incorrect location, it's invalid, but if there's still arterial blood coming from the animal, they can just redo the service. The Gemara says there's a debate if a disqualified person is even initially allowed to slaughter a temple offering, or whether it's only allowed after the fact, which it debates from verses. It's said to be allowed initially besides for if the slaughter was impure, as it's preferable to slaughter while pure, according to rabbinic law. This is unlike semicha, leaning on the animal, which biblically must be done while pure. Entering the temple courtyard while impure is forbidden, so this concept of slaughtering while impure is physically possible if he did so from outside the temple with a really long knife, while doing smicha from outside isn't allowed, as partially entering the courtyard would still be forbidden. There's variation on this discussion. Some actually say that slaughtering offerings while impure is forbidden biblically, the same as smicha. It discusses further as to whether partially entering the temple courtyard has the same legal status as fully entering the courtyard, and that's debated from additional cases regarding particular forms of impurity. In fact, there's a debate if touching sacrificial food while impure will incur lashes or not, which is based on an interpretation of a verse. This is additionally discussed further. There's also an unrelated debate if somebody offered the limbs of a non-kosher animal on the temple altar as to whether that would incur a penalty of lashes or not. The opinion which says yes is as he holds that it's derived from the implication of a positive statement. as it specifies that a specifically kosher animal can be brought, so evidently there's a penalty of lashes for violating that. The other opinion says there's not a penalty of lashes for this, and they debate further from other cases. It also refutes an opinion that says it's permitted to offer a wild animal that's kosher. Anyways, we had stated that if a disqualified person performs the blood service, a qualified person can redo it with the remaining blood. The remaining blood only has the unusable status of remnants if the blood was used with improper intents. There's variation on this and discussion on some verses. It was necessary to state that a person can hand the blood to an unqualified impure person and then have it handed to a disqualified person, and also that it can be handed back from the left hand to the right hand, as an impure person is still technically qualified in some unique circumstances, unlike by a left hand. And the left hand can uniquely be used by the Yom Kippur service, which wouldn't apply by a non-sacred vessel to a sacred vessel. And that last one was mentioned as non-sacred vessels can become consecrated, unlike the other cases. It discusses the logic behind these cases further. There are additional points in the performance of services in the temple. For instance, it said there was no interposition between the courtyard floor and the Kohanim due to all the blood, as they walked on elevated stones. New Mishnah. If somebody slaughtered an offering with other types of improper intent to eat something which cannot be eaten or to burn a part which shouldn't be burnt, it's a debate if the offering is invalid. If somebody intended to eat or burn the proper part but in an improper time or place, but in an amount under an olive's volume, it's valid. If somebody intended to eat half an olive's volume and burn half an olive's volume in an improper time or place, it's valid, as the eating and burning intents are not combined. If somebody slaughtered an offering with intent to eat an olive's volume of the hide, sediment, bones, sinews, horns, or otherwise with improper time or place, it is valid. And if any of those actually do become pigul, having been brought with improper intent, or were eaten past their set times, or were eaten while impure, there is no penalty of kares. If somebody slaughtered consecrated animals with intent to eat its fetus in an improper location, it's not considered pigul. If somebody slaughtered a turtle dove with intent to eat the eggs in an improper location, it's not considered pigul. Regarding eggs or milk that are inside of the actual animal at the time of slaughter, there's no liability of pigul by them, or for leftovers, or for impurity. The Gemara says in opinion, if somebody has improper pigul intent for an offering, the fetus is also pigul. If somebody had an improper pigul intent for the fetus, the actual offering is fine. If somebody had pigul intent for a bird's neck sinew, the crop is pigul. If the person had pigul intent for the bird's crop, the neck sinew is fine. If somebody had pigul intent for the sacrificial parts of the bull that are burned, the bull meat is pigul. If the pigul intent was for the bull meat, the sacrificial parts are fine. It brings sources for this opinion, which are rejected. It continues to try to argue sources, and some actually try to refute this whole principle, citing additional cases. New Mishnah. If somebody slaughtered an offering with improper intent to leave its blood or sacrificial parts until the next day, or with intent to take the parts out of the temple courtyard, it's a debate if they're valid. If somebody slaughtered an offering with intent to apply the blood in the incorrect location, it's still valid. Or if somebody slaughtered an offering with intent that it should be eaten by somebody impure or uncircumcised, or that an uncircumcised person should offer it, or with intent to break the bones of the paschal offering, or to eat the paschal offering half raw, or to mix its blood with invalid blood, in all these cases, in spite of these improper intents, the offering is still valid, as the only improper intents that invalidate an offering are to do it in the wrong time or place, or to bring the paschal or chatas offering not for their own sake. The Gemara explains sources for these opinions. There's a related debate if slaughtering a chatas offering in the south side of the temple causes lashes, which has differing opinions on. It also brings a source which implies that if somebody had improper intents that don't invalidate the offering, and then does the offering with actual pigul intent, there is no pigul. It brings particular cases. And that's the end of chapter 3. Chapter 4 of Tractate Zevachim continues in the laws of temple offerings, further on invalidation through improper intents. The first Mishnah says, Beis Shammai holds regarding blood applied to the outside altar, if there were 2 applications required, and only 1 was done, it's sufficient to effect atonement. By a chatas offering where 4 blood applications are required, 2 would be sufficient. Beis Hillel says by a chatas offering it would be sufficient to just make 1 application, meaning by an offering if somebody made the first blood application properly and then made the second with improper intents called pigul, it would still be valid. If the first and second blood applications were pigul of improper intents for time or place, the offering is pigul and therefore there's liability for consumption by kares, divine punishment. However, by blood applications on the inner altar, if one of them is not done, there's no atonement. So if one is done with pigul, improper intent, the offering is invalid, but there is no liability of kares. The Gemara provides scriptural sources for these points. These are additionally discussed. There are interpretations of relevant verses, which are explained according to opinions on this topic. It also sources the opinions as to whether a minimum of 2 applications of blood are needed when 4 are required, and the opposing opinion, which said 1 application was required. It brings additional sources for these. It also sources a point that blood applications are always on one single part of the altar, never partially between them. Related, Beis Shammai similarly holds that 2 applications of blood would be sufficient for all offerings, and also if 2 are done with pigul improper intent, it would disqualify the offering. Beis Hillel would say 1 application is sufficient for all offerings, and if 1 is done with pigul improper intent, it would disqualify the offering. Related, some hold that the 3 non-essential parts of the blood application of the chatas offering that cannot be performed at night, but they can be done after the death of the owner, there's liability for doing so outside of the temple. Some clarify these steps could have the status of the first initial application, meaning there's liability for being done outside the temple, for being done at night. They can't be done by non-Kohanim. A temple service vessel must be used. They must be applied to the horns of the altar. They must be done with a finger. This blood must be washed out of garments, and any leftover blood is considered to have the status of remnants and is poured by the altar base. There are also like the end of the blood service, in that they can be done after the owner's death. The meat cannot be eaten from this, and there's no pigul, and it's invalidated if brought inside the temple sanctuary. It debates sources for this concept. These are additionally discussed. It also sources the point that if bloods applied to the inner altar are missing an application, it doesn't affect atonement. There are further points on this. And it sources additional steps of the application services on the pariachas curtain, on the altar horns, as to which steps are particularly essential, and various opinions on these. It's explained. There's a comparison in sacrificial procedure between the communal error bull offering and the Yom Kippur he-goat, as even though they're different species, they have the same procedure. Then, based on this, if there are 2 offerings with the same species, the Kohen Gadol's bull chatas and the Yom Kippur bull chatas, some try and derive that here they would therefore have the same procedure. It debates this from principles of scriptural derivation and quotes sources. There are further points. The Mishnah ended by saying, by the inner altar, if only one of the blood applications was done with pigul improper intent, it's invalid, but there's no punishment of kares. There's a similar concept quoted in the following tractate, Menachos, on a single step of a service being done with pigul. It's a debate there if it would cause the entire offering to become pigul or not. It debates this in comparison to our Mishnah, and argues as to what the difference between cases is. This is argued on further. Some define the difference to be that typically you cannot cause pigul during only part of a permitter, the main step of the service, but if somebody does pigul during part of the permitter and is silent during the remainder of the procedure, we assume his incorrect intent was maintained and it's fully pigul. Others disagree and cite seemingly contradictory cases. New Mishnah. The following have no liability for pigul, service with improper intent, for eating them. According to Rabbi Meir, they are select parts of the flour offering, the incense, the flour offering of Kohanim or of the Kohen Gadol, the blood of any offering, and independently brought libations. The sages say even libations brought with animal offerings are excluded from liability of pigul. There's a debate if there's liability by the oil offering brought by a Mesora, a leper. Some say there is, as the blood of the Asham offering makes it permissible, which is a permitter, and anything with a permitter, whether for eating or for the altar, has liability for pigul. Similarly, the Ola offering's blood application permits its meat to be burned on the altar, and its hide to be used by Kohanim. The bird Ola offering's blood application permits its meat to be burned on the altar. The bird Chatas offering's blood application permits its meat to be eaten by Kohanim. The burned bulls and he-goats blood applications permit their sacrificial parts to be brought on the altar. Some say anything brought on the outer altar, like the Shalomim offering was, there's no liability of pigul for it. The Gemara says there's an opinion that if kaimetz, the handful part of the flour offering, is brought onto the altar, if it was pigul, the pigul status is removed, as clearly the burning on the altar can affect its status. Obviously, it's known that there's no liability for pigul by eating the kaimetz offering or similar, so it teaches that so long as the offering catches fire, even if it's removed from the altar, it can still be viably put back up there without liability for pigul. Based on this discussion, some derive that if there's a kaimetz offering that was pigul and half was burnt on the altar and half was on the floor, the half on the floor can also then be placed on the altar. In fact, some learned that if there is an offering that's pigul left over or impure and it catches fire on the altar, its prohibition is removed. Others debate this, and there's additional discussion here, additionally on some principles of laws of impurity. Anyways, we stated that anything with a permitter for people or the altar, the liability of pigul can apply to it. And of course, the source for this principle and discusses it further. It also sources the remaining points, like the permitter of the bird offerings, along with related discussion. It does rule in accordance with the opinion that if somebody has pigul intent by something done outside the temple sanctuary, there's pigul, but if it was pigul for something done inside the sanctuary, there's no pigul, and it gives examples. Technically, this has no practical application until Mashiach comes, but it clarifies technically the entire Tractate of Zevachim has no practical application until Mashiach comes, and yet we study it anyways. New Mishnah. Regarding the temple offerings of non-Jewish people, there's a debate if there's liability for pigul, leftovers, or eating them while impure, or slaughtering them outside the temple. The Gemara says further on temple offerings of a non-Jewish person, also, there's no liability of me'ilah from impermissibly benefiting from them. They don't produce teruma tithes. There are no voluntary libations, although there is libations brought by their animal offerings. Others disagree and say based on the verse that the temple offerings of a non-Jewish person have the exact same status as that of a Jewish person. It's based these from sources. It discusses this further as to whether there's variation between Jewish and non-Jewish people regarding the acceptance of offerings. New Mishnah. With all the things we listed, that there's exemption for the application of pigul, there's still liability for leftovers or eating them while impure, besides for by blood. Others hold that there is liability by these only when you eat something typically eaten, which would exclude things like wood, incense, and similar. And there's no liability for impurity by those. The Gemara quotes sources for this concept along with related ones by principles of forbidden leftover offerings. There are additional sources quoted as to why blood is an exception by this and related. Anyways, when it's disputed as to whether there's only liability for things typically eaten regarding impurity, some said this applies to impurity of the actual food. Others say this only applies to impurity of the person eating the food. This is debated further. New Mishnah. A temple offering should be offered with the intent of being for the sake of 6 things. For the offering, for the offerer, for God, for the fires, for the smell, and to please God. The chatas and asham offerings also have for the sin that was committed. Rabbi Yossi holds, even if any of these are missing, so it's done without specific intent, it's valid, as the court stipulated that such was permissible. The Gemara quotes sources for these related. It said, a sacrifice brought for the sake of an olah offering is invalid, but if it was slaughtered for a regular or unconsecrated food, it's valid. It sources this, although others disagree. Also, a chata slaughtered for the sake of unconsecration is valid, but if it was slaughtered assuming that it actually was unconsecrated, it's invalid. There are related points and sources the latter statement of the Mishnah. Essentially, the latter point holds that the original owner's intent can define the status of the offering, which there are a few opinions on as to how that relates to other laws. Some say it's a principle that only applies within the temple by things like offerings. Others say that this can also apply by things like the laws of Shabbos. Others disagree, as laws of Shabbos specifically forbid calculated, thought-through labor, so it would go by the intent of the man performing the actual work, not the owner. And that's the end of Chapter 4. Chapter 5 of Tractate Zevachim continues covering the various laws of temple offerings. The first Mishnah says, regarding the proper locations of temple offerings, by Kachi Kachim variant offerings, most holy ones, those were slaughtered in the north part of the courtyard, which will be defined. The bull and he-goat of the Yom Kippur service were offered in the north, their blood reception was done in a vessel in the north, and their blood sprinkling was done between the poles of the ark, towards the curtain, and on the golden altar. There is no atonement if any of these were missing. The Kohen Gadol would pour the remainder of the blood at the base of the outer altar. If he didn't do this, there would still be atonement. Burned bull or he-goat offerings were slaughtered in the north, their blood reception was with a vessel in the north, and their blood sprinkling was done towards the curtain and on the golden altar. There's no atonement if any of these are missing. The remainder of the blood was poured on the western base of the outside altar. If this wasn't done, there's still atonement. The Yom Kippur bull and he-goat and the burned bull and he-goats were burned in the place of ashes, which was a location outside of Jerusalem. The Gemara says, by the Kachay Kachim offering, it didn't mention that its blood reception was done with a vessel in the north part of the courtyard, like it does by the other cases, as at this point they held that there was one type of Kachay Kachim offering that actually wasn't done with a vessel, it was done by hand, namely the Mitzora lepers Asham offering, although it was later held that there too required a vessel. It's sourced. Regarding the order of the Mishnah, it first brought the case of the inner chatas offering on Yom Kippur, as that was derived from scriptural exegesis, and also it was done in the innermost room of the temple, so it was brought first. Anyways, it begins listing sources for all these points, that those offerings were slaughtered in the north, and the locations of the other steps. This is additionally discussed. Also, it mentions that by an Ola offering, a slaughter and blood reception was done in the north, which is essential for its validity, and it also spends some time sourcing. There are further points on this, along with the fact that the Asham offering must be slaughtered and received in the north, which is also essential, which it too is sourced at length, quoting a number of verses. This is additionally discussed, and it brings up a few principles of scriptural exegesis and expounds on them, and they're used to derive these individual principles of slaughtering and receiving in the north by the Chatas, Asham, and Ola offerings. There are further points on this and these complex principles of scriptural exegesis. There are additional points. It also sources the fact that excess blood remnants would be poured out by the base of the outside altar specifically. This is qualified. It explains the necessity for the brought verses on this, and it debates if this process is essential for certain offerings. It said it's essential for the Chatas offerings, although it debates particularities and as to who holds these opinions. New Mishnah. The communal and personal Chatas offerings and the he-goats of Rosh Chodesh and holidays were slaughtered in the north. Their blood reception was done in a vessel in the north, and their blood was applied 4 times to the 4 horns of the outer altar. The Kohen would go up the ramp, turn on the ledge, go to the southeast corner, then to the northeast corner, then to the northwest corner, then to the southwest corner, applying blood by each. The remaining blood would be poured out by the southern base of the altar. These offerings were eaten within the courtyard's curtains by male Kohanim. They would be prepared in any manner, and the timing to eat them was for a day and the following night until midnight. The Gemara explains the actual application of the blood. Some say it could be done within a cubit of the corner, others say it would specifically need to be applied along the edge of the corner below the horn. This is in accordance with the opinion that the blood could be applied even below the horn, as they debate where this exactly extends until. If further debates between these opinions, it also mentions as there was variation by blood applications to the altar as to whether it's applied to the top half or bottom half of the altar. There was a red line marked around the middle of the altar as a partition, which it sources. It also sources the point that the remainder of the blood by these offerings was poured out by the southern base of the altar, although there's actually debate. Some say inner and outer Chatas offerings are actually poured out by the western base instead. This is as they actually dispute where the altar was placed, some saying it was actually in the northern section of the courtyard. New Mishnah. The Ola offering is a Koche Kachim variant offering, so its slaughter and blood reception with a vessel are done in the north. Its blood has 2 applications, which are 4, as it's applied to opposite corners on both sides of each corner. It is skinned and dismembered and is entirely burnt in the fires. The Gemara explains why this offering is specifically singled out to be mentioned, as it's not specified as a Koche Kachim offering in its source. It also explains how the blood applications were done, as mentioned, on 2 opposite corners, although it's a debate if there's 2 points of blood made or just one L shape. Also, it mentions the shape of the altar, which only had a base on half of it, which was due to the division of land between tribes, which went straight through the middle of the temple. Although it is debated what it means that the southeast corner base was missing. Some say it's literal, others just say no blood was applied there. It debates this from a number of discussions. It further expounds on the structure of the altar and on the division of the land of Israel and the location of the temple site. New Mishnah. The communal Shalomim offering, the Asham offering, be it for theft, me'ilah, adultery with a betrothed maidservant, an Asham of a Nazir, of a Mitzorah, leper, and the Asham Taloi offering, all of these are slaughtered and received in a vessel in the north, and their blood requires 2 applications that are 4, as described earlier. They are eaten within the courtyard's curtains by male Kohanim. They can be prepared, however, and the time to eat them was for a day until the following midnight. The Gemara quotes sources for these principles and qualifies some points on these. New Mishnah. Now on Koche Kalim variant offerings, the Toda offering and the Nazir's ram can be slaughtered anywhere in the courtyard. Their blood requires 2 applications that are like 4. They can be eaten anywhere in Jerusalem by anybody, prepared, however, for a day until the next midnight. The portions of these given to Kohanim have the same status, besides that they can only be eaten by Kohanim, their wives, their children, and their slaves. The Gemara quotes sources for these principles. New Mishnah. Shlamim offerings are Koche Kalim. Their slaughter can be done anywhere in the temple courtyard. Their blood requires 2 applications that are 4. They can be eaten anywhere in Jerusalem by anybody, prepared, however, for 2 days and a night. The portions of these given to Kohanim have the same status, besides that they can only be eaten by Kohanim, their wives, their children, and their slaves. The Gemara again quotes sources for these principles. It debates as to which verses exactly source these points. It also mentions an argument as to whether it's sufficient for the sanctuary curtain to be closed by just a curtain in front. It's said to be insufficient, and if there's a high object in the way, that's disputed. It also defines some dimensions of the temple courtyard in regards to principles of impurity, which is said to be 187 by 135 cubits. Sources are quoted, although the exact dimensions of everything will be recorded in detail in the second to last tractate, Tractate Midos. It also defines the consecration status of the chambers, whether by biblical or rabbinic law. It also sources the concept that offering blood becomes disqualified at sunset. This is discussed. It also debates if somebody, while offering a shlamim offering, if he intends to eat the meat on the eve of the 3rd day, as to if this is valid or not and therefore invalidated as pigul. There's also a debate if there's liability for actually eating the meat at this point. It debates sources. New Mishnah. The Bechor offering, the Ma'aser offering, and the Paschal offering all are Koche Kalim variants. Their slaughter can be done anywhere in the temple courtyard. The blood requires 1 application opposite the base of the altar. The Bechor is eaten by only Kohanim. The Ma'aser is eaten by anybody, both in Jerusalem, both prepared in any manner, for 2 days and a night. The Paschal offering is eaten only at night until midnight, only by people registered for it, and only roasted. The Gemara debates the author of this Mishnah based on individual opinions. It also sources all these principles. It debates some principles of scriptural exegesis by these laws and further discusses who authored these points. And that's the end of chapter 5. Chapter 6 of Tractate Zevachim continues on laws of temple offerings. The first Mishnah says, if Kohanim Kachim variant offerings are being slaughtered on top of the altar, some say they're valid if slaughtered in the north of the courtyard, others say it could be done from the middle half of the courtyard and northward. The Gemara explains, this is as the first opinion held that the entire altar was located in the north part of the temple. This is based on a related dispute as to which parts of the altar are suitable to offer the Ola offering on. Related, if somebody offered a Kohanim Kachim variant offering on the ground opposite the altar, it's disqualified. It then debates as to what the ground opposite the altar here refers to, and it's explained it refers to a theoretical case where the altar is shrunk and they're using the ground it once stood on. It also debates from sources as to where exactly the altar stood in the temple. This is additionally discussed, again going over particular measurements, although this will all be covered in greater detail by the later tractates, Talmud and Midos. These dimensions and placements of the temple implements are spoken on further, arguing as to whether the altar was positioned in the north or south of the courtyard. It said if the altar became damaged, then all offerings slaughtered in the courtyard become disqualified, and it discusses the source for this concept. Some say this would even extend to offerings delayed being brought until the altar is repaired, that they'd still be invalid. This is based on an argument as to whether living things can become permanently rejected from the altar. It additionally discusses these principles, along with further points on the measurements of the altar. There are further points on this, along with a brief point as to whether the floor of the courtyard was sanctified to allow the blood service to be performed there too. Anyways, if the altar was damaged, it's said that the remaining portion of the mincha offering can no longer be eaten from it. Additional sources are brought additionally for principles of the ma'is or sheni tide, such as that it's not eaten nowadays, and as to whether that also applies to the bechor offering, and based on this, whether Kohanim Kalim variant offerings cannot be eaten if the altar is damaged. It's discussed further. And it's additionally stated that the altar of the temple at Shiloh was made of stones, which it sources, and additionally brings points on the offerings of this older altar. It also says the maximum size of the altar could be 60 cubits long, just like the temple, and additionally sources its precise location. Some say the angel Michael was seen bringing offerings by its location, others say the ashes the ram offered instead of Yitzchak, Isaac, were lying in that place. It's discussed. Further, we know the altars of the first and second temple were different sizes. Apparently, there weren't requirements for the altar to be any one particular size based on this, although it says it couldn't be smaller than the altar of Moshe, and it defines the measurement of that too. It also sources the point that the altar ramp was on its south side and was 32 by 16 cubits. Additional sources for these principles are discussed, and it argues as to whether there was a gap between the altar and its ramp, as to whether the meat had to be tossed over. It's also said there were these two minor ramps to the sides of the altar, which were used by the Kohanim to perform the services by the ledge. It's also said the ramp and altar combined were 62 cubits long, even though both were 32 cubits long individually, as the ramp extended a bit over the altar's base and ledge. Also, all of the ramps in the temple were slanted at a 3:1 ratio, besides for the main altar ramp, which was slanted at a 3 5/9 to 1 ratio. New Mishnah. Mincha flour offerings would have their handful separated anywhere in the courtyard, and were eaten within the courtyard's curtains by male Kohanim, prepared, however, for a day until the following midnight. The Gemara says this handful could viably be separated in the temple sanctuary itself, just like the frankincense could be removed within the sanctuary. Others debate this, and it's also argued as to whether a shalomim offering could be slaughtered in the temple sanctuary. New Mishnah. The bird chatas offering would be done by the southwest corner of the altar, although it technically could be done anywhere. Other things done by the southwest corner, the mincha flour offerings and the pouring of blood remnants, were done by the lower half of the altar, and the wine libations, water libations, and bird ola offerings, if there wasn't room by the east side, were all done on the upper half of the altar. Related, anybody climbing up the altar would go towards the right to the southeast corner, it would go around and then descend on the left. The exceptions to this were by the wine libations, the water libations, and the bird ola offerings, where they would descend the same way they had gone up. The Gemara quotes scriptural sources for all these principles. When it said that the bird chatas could be done anywhere, that referred to its slaughter, but the blood sprinkling had to be done in the southwest corner, which then sources. Typically, the bird olas would be done by the southeast corner, as that's right where the place of ashes was, where the leftover bird parts were dumped. However, if the place was full, as seen in a few quoted cases, it would instead be done by the southwest corner. The reason that the libations and bird olas didn't have the Kohen walk fully around the altar is so they don't get damaged from the smoke. There are related points. New Mishnah. Further on the process of the bird chatas offering, it would be slaughtered not with a knife, but through a process called milika, which involved the Kohen pressing his thumbnail into the bird's neck. although the head wouldn't be separated. Some of its blood would be sprinkled on the southwest corner of the altar, and the remainder would be squeezed by the base. All of its meat would be eaten by the Kohanim. The Gemara additionally describes the steps of this process. New Mishnah. Regarding the offering of the bird olah, the Kohen would go up the ramp to the southeast corner, slaughter the bird with melika, separate the head fully, its blood would be squeezed out on the altar wall, and then the head would have blood squeezed out onto the wall. The head would be placed in salt and placed in the fire. The body would have its crop and feathers and entrails removed, which would be dumped in the place of ashes. The body would be split partially open, although if it was split fully in two, that was fine, which were then placed in salt and then into the fire. If parts of this process were missing, he didn't remove the crop or feathers, or he forgot to place it in salt. If it was after the blood was squeezed out, it's still valid. If the chatas bird's head was fully separated, or if the olah bird's head was not separated, it's invalid. If the bird olah had only its head blood squeezed out, it's invalid, but if only the body blood was squeezed out, it's valid. If somebody slaughtered a bird chatas or squeezed its blood out not for its own sake, the offering is invalid. If it was for a bird olah, it's valid, but it just doesn't fulfill its owner's obligation. For a bird chatas and olah, if they were slaughtered or squeezed with intent of an improper location, it's invalid with no penalty of kares, divine punishment. If his intent was to eat it in its incorrect time, it's pigul, and there's a liability of kares, assuming the blood had been sprinkled or squeezed out, which is called the permitter. It brings a few cases where the permitter wouldn't be offered properly. It lists some particular cases where there would be no liability of pigul. Some simply hold if his improper intent of time went before his intent of location, there's liability for pigul and kares. If his intent of location went first, there's no liability. Others say there's just no difference. If his intent was to eat half an olive's volume and burn half an olive's volume, the offering is valid, as intent for eating and burning don't combine. The Gemara at length discusses the relevant verses on the bird olah offering. Our Mishnah said that separating the head from the chatas bird offering entirely would make it invalid. Others disagree, as they say the blood squeezing of this offering is not essential. Alternatively, they dispute whether the delay in cutting the second pipe of the bird in slaughter makes it invalid. Alternatively, the issue is as to whether cutting through a majority of the neck is essential to making the offering valid. That's discussed. When we said that if the blood of the body was squeezed out but not of the head, it's valid. This is as most of the bird's blood is located in its body. And that's the end of chapter 6. Chapter 7 of Tractate Zevachim continues on the laws of the temple bird offerings. The first Mishnah says, a bird chatas offering that was offered below the red line on the altar with the procedure and intent for a chatas offering is valid. If he used the chatas procedure but had intent for an olah offering, or with an olah procedure but with intent for a chatas, or with an olah procedure with intent for an olah, it's invalid. If he did any of these above the red line, the offering is invalid. The bird olah, which is brought above the red line, if done as an olah with intent as an olah, it's valid. If it was done as an olah with intent as a chatas, it's valid, although it doesn't fulfill any obligation. If it was offered with the chatas procedure with intent as an olah, or with chatas procedure with intent as a chatas, it's invalid. If any of these were offered below the red line, it's invalid. The Gemara explains, the procedure that's being mixed up by the chatas bird offering here is the method of blood sprinkling, although it's possible the first part could refer to a difference in method of slaughter. By the olah bird offering, it's explained that the first and last cases are where he changed the method slaughter, and the middle section has variation on squeezing the blood. New Mishnah. All of these listed bird offerings in the prior Mishnah, their slaughtered throat gives off no impurity, although there's liability for misusing them for personal benefits, besides for the chatas bird offering that was done entirely properly. Regarding the bird olah done as a chatas and with intent as a chatas, there's a debate if there's liability for misusing it. It debates the logic between these and additionally argues on this from particular cases. The Gemara further expounds on this debate along with various others. Their individual logics are additionally discussed. New Mishnah. If an unqualified person did melika, slaughtering a bird offering, it's invalid, but there's no impurity contamination from its throat. If a Kohen improperly performed melika with his left hand opposed to with his right, or he improperly did this at nighttime, or he slaughtered an unconsecrated bird inside the temple courtyard, or with a consecrated bird outside the courtyard, these would also not contaminate impurity from their throat. If the Kohen did melika with a knife instead of his nail, or he did melika with an unconsecrated bird inside the courtyard or with a consecrated bird outside the courtyard, or he used turtle doves that were too young, or pigeons that were too old, or a bird with an atrophied wing, or one that was blind or missing a foot, they would contaminate impurity from their throat. Generally, if the bird becomes invalidated through the course of its offering, it would not contaminate impurity, but if it started off invalid in the first place, it would. The Gemara says, some rule that melika done with the left hand or at night do not contaminate impurity from the throat, while a bird that was slaughtered by a Kohen or with a knife would. It questions the logic of this, and others disagree, saying a bird slaughtered by a non-Kohen would not actually contaminate impurity. It debates this from our Mishnah. Related, it said if a non-Kohen does kemitza, taking the handful of the flour offering, it does go down if placed on the altar, but this wouldn't apply by a non-Kohen slaughtering a bird. It explains why these two aren't comparable. Anyways, it said if a bird was slaughtered improperly, whether by the left hand or at night, even inside the courtyard, it would be invalid and contaminate with impurity, which it sources and discusses. New Mishnah. If the Kohen slaughtered a bird offering with malika and then finds the bird has a defect, there's a debate if it contaminates impurity from its throat. Rabbi Meir says no, Rabbi Yehuda says yes. The debate sources essentially from whether it's comparable to an animal carcass. The Gemara additionally expounds on their individual sources. It further goes through these quoted verses. Anyways, when Rabbi Meir says that malika by a bird causes no impurity, it's a debate if this applies if it has a blemish or even without one. It argues how this would apply by other types of animals, such as by the egla arufa. And that's the end of chapter 7. Chapter 8 of Tractate Zevachim covers the laws of mixed-up temple offerings. The first Mishnah says, any offering that got mixed up with invalidated chatas offerings that had to be left to die, or if an ox that was sentenced to be stoned for killing somebody got mixed up with a bunch of valid animals, they all must be left to die. If valid offerings got mixed with an animal that was used to commit a sin, such as that it killed somebody but there was only one witness, or the animal was used for bestiality, or was designated as an offering for an idol, or it was worshipped as an idol, or it was mixed with the wages for a harlot or the payment to acquire a dog, or it was mixed with a crossbreed animal or an animal with a defect, or with an animal born via a C-section, so it was mixed with something invalid as an offering. Essentially, the animals should be left to graze until they develop a blemish, and they should then be sold, and the value of the most expensive one of them should be used to bring the same type of offering. If valid offerings got mixed up with unconsecrated, unblemished animals, then these unconsecrated animals should be sold as this type of offering. If two offerings of the same type got mixed up, they should each be offered for the sake of their owner. If offerings became mixed with offerings of a different kind, they should be left to graze until they develop a blemish, and should then be sold, and the money of the more expensive one should be used to buy one of each type of offering, and the owner repays the difference from his own funds. If the offering was mixed with bechor or ma'aser offerings, they should be left to graze until they develop a blemish, and should then be eaten as bechor or ma'aser offerings. It's possible that any type of offering can viably be mixed up with other types, besides for the chatas and asham offerings mixing with each other, as those are just two different types of animals. The Gemara says, the extent of the first point is that if one animal that is sentenced to death got mixed with 10,000 regular animals, and they're not sure which is the prohibited one, all of the animals must be left to die. This applies whether the mixture is forbidden for temple or personal use. This is why it needed to quote this concept here and in other locations in the Gemara, to show this applies whether the animals were for temple or personal use. Now, there is a general principle that things can be nullified in a large mixture, but that wouldn't apply to things that are specifically sold by number, as discussed here. Similar cases on this are cited. Or it's just that living creatures are considered significant and cannot be nullified. Removing the animals from this mixture one by one wouldn't work, as each is treated as if it has a 50-50 probability of being forbidden. This applies so long as the animal is in its current place. And it doesn't work to just force the animals to move, as there's a rabbinic prohibition there out of concern that somebody may take one of the animals while it's still in its place. So it's said to be ruled that none of the animals in this mixture could affect acceptance as an offering. Others debate this point. A related dispute, if the ring adornment of an idol got mixed up with 100 permitted rings, and one of the rings fell into the Mediterranean Sea, some say we assume that that was the forbidden one, and the remaining are permitted, and others disagree. A similar case, if a ring of an idol got mixed with 100 permitted rings, and 40 of that mixture were pushed in one direction and 60 were pushed in the other, and then the 40 rings are put with a new mixture, they don't prohibit anything. But if the 60 rings are put with a new mixture, they would, as we assume the forbidden ring is with the majority. Nevertheless, others dispute this, saying it would even be forbidden in the smaller mixture. This is discussed. Somewhat related, it said if a cask of teruma tithe wines got mixed with 100 casks of ordinary wines, and one of them falls into the Dead Sea, they're all permitted, as we assume the forbidden cask was the one that fell. Now, this is nearly identical to the case by the idolatrous ring, and both are stated, as teruma wine still has a permitted use, and a ring is unique as it's said to be not really noticeable. So it said if a teruma fig fell into a pile, it's still allowed once one leaves, even though it's not noticeable as it makes them permitted through its exit. Some hold that if a cask of teruma wine gets mixed with 100 casks of ordinary wine, you can open all the casks and take out a percentage for the teruma tithe, and then drink the remainder. Others say this is only allowed once the casks were opened accidentally. Similarly, if there were 150 casks of wine and a cask of teruma wine got mixed in and 100 were accidentally opened, you can remove a teruma tithe from those and drink the rest. However, you can't open the remainder, as we don't assume the forbidden cask was of the majority. Regarding the animal mixed with prohibited animals that have a major defect, this would have to be where the defect is discernible, but the animals it got mixed with just share an identical wound. Others just say the defect in this case is not discernible, such as that it fell off of a roof. Others say that the valid animal in this case got mixed with the offspring of an animal with a major defect, according to the opinion that such an animal cannot be offered on the altar. These three opinions were brought, as some disagree with the first, saying you'd be able to tell the difference between different defects. They disagree with the second, as they say if it fell off a roof, you could tell if there's a defect based on if it can stand 24 hours later. And by the final opinion, they just disagree with the offspring of an animal with a defect, that it's prohibited. Then we said that if offerings get mixed with offerings of their same kind, they should just be offered for their owner. Here, smicha, leaning on the animal, wouldn't be required, as smicha is done by the owner on his own animal, which wouldn't work here, as apparently this case is where they were brought by women, where smicha isn't required. It debates if this is strictly true by specific types of offerings. It also qualifies principles of the bechor offering as to when and how it can be offered. Specifically, it's asked if a blemished bechor is being consecrated to the temple fund. It's argued as to if it can be degraded by doing something like selling it to meat in the market, or if giving profit to the temple takes precedence. When we said that all offerings can be mixed besides for the chatas with the asham, as one is a he-goat with hair, and one is a ram with wool. Also, a paschal offering and an asham being mixed weren't mentioned as prohibited, in spite of the fact that the animals need to be different specific ages, 1 or 2 years old, as those animals just look very similar when they're those ages. New Mishnah. If an asham got mixed with a shlamim offering, some say they should both be slaughtered in the north part of the temple courtyard, and they should be eaten according to the more stringent one. Here, the asham. Others say this isn't permitted. If slices of meat from one offering got mixed with slices of another type of offering, whether it's a kache kachim mixed with a kache kalam type offering, or if it's eaten for 1 day and a night mixed with one eaten for 2 days and a night, it's eaten according to the more stringent of the two. The Gemara says, it's taught that sabbatically your produce funds cannot be used to purchase teruma tithes, as that limits the amount of time it could be eaten. It argues the author of this principle. This concept is additionally discussed along with some further points. This goes on to bring some particular concerns of offering oil by the Mitzorah offerings and related. It's mentioned that typically donating oil wasn't permitted, but here it's allowed towards the Mitzorah to facilitate his offering. It's debated as to whether donating an Asham Taloi offering is permissible. New Mishnah. If the limbs of a Chatas offering got mixed with the limbs of an Olah offering, Rabbi Eliezer says they should all just be burnt on the altar. And we view the chatas meat as if it's just being burnt on tinder. The sages say they should be left overnight, and they should be then taken to the place of burning. The Gemara quotes scriptural sources explaining their individual logics. There's different opinions as to exactly what they're disagreeing on. That's discussed. New Mishnah. If the limbs of a valid Olah offering are mixed with the limbs of a blemished Olah offering, Rabbi Eliezer holds that if one of their heads was offered, all the legs should be offered. And if one of the legs was offered, all the legs should be offered. The sages disagree and say if they haven't been offered, they should be taken to the place where invalid offerings are burnt. The Gemara says Rabbi Eliezer permitted these two offering heads to be burnt, as one is definitely permissible, but not just one. The new Mishnah. If sacrificial blood was mixed with water, if it has the appearance of blood, it's fine. If the blood was mixed with wine, it's viewed as if it was mixed with water. If sacrificial offering blood became mixed with regular blood of a wild animal, we view it as if it was mixed with water. Others just say that blood cannot nullify blood. If blood of an offering got mixed with blood of an invalid offering, it should be all poured out into the temple canal. If offering blood was mixed with non-arterial offering blood that was just draining out, it's a debate if this is valid or if it should just be dumped out, although it said if it was applied to the altar, it's valid. The Gemara says the blood and water mixture is only where the water fell into the blood. If the blood fell into the water, each drop of blood is nullified as it mixes with the water. This would not apply by the concept of covering the blood of a slaughtered animal, as there's no rejection from that principle. Some rule if somebody simultaneously eats pigol, an offering with improper intent, leftover meat, and impure meat, there is no liability of punishment, as while he chews, each larger piece is nullifying the others. This teaches that forbidden items can nullify each other, that the concept that a forbidden food prohibits permitted food through a transfer of flavor is only a rabbinic concept, and that a questionable warning is not considered a valid warning. It actually ends up retracting the second of these principles, and it additionally debates these points. Anyways, after further discussion, it explains that the status of a mixture of two different foods is determined by flavor, a mixture of two of the same foods is determined by majority, and if appearance is a relevant factor, it's determined by appearance. Anyways, it was said that mitzvahs cannot nullify each other, and forbidden items cannot nullify each other. For instance, by mitzvahs, the sage Hillel on Passover would simultaneously eat a sandwich of matzah and maror, which wouldn't nullify each other. Other examples are given. Regarding the debate as to the validity of offering blood and draining blood, some say it's as to whether decrees for such were allowed to be made in the temple. Others say the dispute as to whether they hold draining blood to be more common than arterial blood. There's issues based on the wording with the first opinion. New Mishnah. If blood of an unblemished offering mixed with blood of blemished offerings, it should be poured out into the canal. If a cup of blood was mixed with other cups of blood, Rabbi Eliezer says, if one cup was offered, the remaining should also be offered. The sages disagree and say any unoffered cup should be dumped out. If bloods that were supposed to be applied to the lower half of the altar were mixed with bloods applied to the upper half of the altar, Rabbi Eliezer says that all of these should be applied to the upper half, and those that were incorrectly placed should just be viewed as if they're water, and the remainder should be applied to the lower half. The sages say that it should all be dumped out, but if it was applied, it's fine. If bloods requiring one application were mixed with other bloods requiring one application, they should all be applied in one application. If bloods requiring four-sided applications were mixed with bloods requiring four-sided applications, they should just be applied in four-sided applications. If bloods requiring four-sided applications were mixed with bloods requiring one application, it's a debate if they should be applied one or four times based on whether the concern is of adding or subtracting unnecessarily. They argue the logic. The Gemara says, when Rabbi Eliezer permitted applying four-sided applications by these mixed cups, some say this is only if they're applied two at a time, so there's at least one service being done properly. A similar dispute existed in the earlier Mishnah in this chapter regarding mixed limbs. Both are cited as mixed limbs already have their atonement affected on the altar, unlike here where the blood hasn't been yet thrown. Related discussions are quoted regarding mixtures by laws of impurity and similar. These are additionally spoken on. It's essentially operating on a debate as to whether two liquids in a vessel entirely blend or not, and how this relates to a few cases involving the blood service of temple offerings. It also disputes a number of sources. New Mishnah. If bloods applied inside the temple sanctuary get mixed with bloods that are applied outside, they should be poured into the canal. If this mixture was applied outside and then inside, it's valid. If it was applied inside and then outside, it's a dispute. Rabbi Akiva says it's invalid as it was brought into the sanctuary. The sages say it's valid unless it's chatas blood brought into the sanctuary, which is invalid. Rabbi Eliezer says asham blood would also be invalid. The Gemara says Rabbi Eliezer didn't dispute the Mishnah's initial point that it can first be applied inside and then outside because of these exceptions by the chatas and asham offerings. It additionally explains the logic of the individual opinions and quotes sources. New Mishnah, if a chatas offering had its blood received in two cups, if one was taken outside the temple courtyard, the other is still valid. If one was taken into the temple sanctuary, it's a debate if the other is still valid. If blood was brought into the temple sanctuary with intent to apply it, if it wasn't applied, it's a debate. Some say it's invalid, some say it is valid, some say it's valid if brought unintentionally. Regarding all invalidated bloods that are applied to the altar, the tzitz, which is this, doesn't affect acceptance, besides for by impure blood. The Gemara additionally discusses these cases. It brings sources and related points. Scriptural verses are quoted showing the invalidation of offering blood brought inside the temple sanctuary. It additionally elaborates on the individual opinions as to if blood was brought into sanctuary to be applied and wasn't actually applied, if it's then made invalid or not. And that's the end of chapter 8. Chapter 9 of Tractate Zevachim continues covering laws of temple offerings. The first Mishnah says, if something fit for an offering goes on the temple altar, it becomes sanctified, even if it was invalid. Rabbi Yeshua says this means if it's fit for the altar fires, it should just be left up there based on a verse. Rabban Gamliel says if something's fit for any part of the altar, it should be left up there based on a verse. So the difference between these opinions is by the blood and by libations, as Rabban Gamliel would say they should be left up there, and Rabbi Yeshua would disagree. Rabbi Shimon holds that whether the offering in question is valid and its libations are not, or if its libations are valid and the offering is not, or if both are invalid, the offering should be left on the altar and the libations should be removed. The Gemara says, when it said that the altar sanctifies what's fit for it, that was to exclude something like the kamitza, handful of the flour offering that wasn't sanctified in a temple service vessel. This is as they are lacking in an act of themselves which would allow them to be fit for the altar. Regarding the various opinions as to what's sanctified and left on the temple altar, it debates what they derive from each other's verses and as to why they don't hold like each other. Besides for these, there are other opinions. Rabbi Yesi Havilili and Rabbi Akiva debate over if the bird ola offering can be left on the altar if it's invalid, based on the source for this concept. They would also uniquely hold that an invalid mincha libation offering brought on the altar must be removed. By an invalid mincha libation that comes with an offering, only Rabban Gamliel and Rabbi Yeshua say it should be left on the altar. Rabban Gamliel and Rabbi Shimon alone hold individual invalid wine libations should be left on the altar. These libations with an offering that are invalid, only Rabban Gamliel holds they should be left on the altar. This would apply even if the libation was offered a day after the offering. New Mishnah. Further, invalid offerings which if brought on the altar should be left there. An offering which was left overnight, or one that wasn't removed from the courtyard, or which became impure, or one that was slaughtered with improper intent of time or location, or if the blood was received or thrown by a disqualified person. Rabbi Yehuda says, excluded from this list of invalid offerings which if brought on the altar should actually be removed from the temple altar. Any offerings that were slaughtered at night, if their blood was spilled or if their blood was removed beyond the curtains. Rabbi Shimon disagrees, as he holds the only way something could be fully disqualified to be removed from the altar is if it was invalid before it ever even entered the temple courtyard. Examples of this are if the animal was used for bestiality, if it was designated as an offering for an idol, if it was worshipped, it was used to pay a harlot, it was exchanged for a dog, it's a mixed breed, it had a disqualifying defect, if it was born via C-section, or if it had a blemish. Rabbi Akiva actually says if it was blemished, it's fine to be left on the altar. Others disagree. If something was removed from the altar, it should not be brought back up. If something was brought up onto the altar while alive, it should be removed. This would apply to the Ola offering. If the animal was slaughtered on top of the actual altar, it should be skinned and dismembered there, and then burnt. The Gemara quotes scriptural sources for all of these listed opinions. These are discussed. There's a related case. If somebody slaughtered a consecrated animal at nighttime and then offered it outside the temple courtyard, he's said to be liable. Some say this should be treated as strict as an offering slaughtered and offered outside the temple courtyard where there's two liabilities. Others refute this. It said sacrificial parts of Kohanim variant offerings that were brought onto the altar before the blood was thrown should be left there, as they are now part of the altar's fare. Supports for this are brought and discussed along with the remaining points as to what, for instance, exactly is done with an Ola offering that's brought onto the altar while alive, as to whether it's skinned and dismembered, and similar. It also further disputes as to whether Kohanim type offerings that were brought onto the altar before the throwing of the blood, if they can remain there. Anyways, when Rabbi Akiva said that blemished animals brought on the altar are valid to remain, it said that he meant specifically by the blemish of a cataract, and also only when it developed its blemish after consecration. So Rabbi Akiva would hold by a female Ola offering that the altar doesn't sanctify it if it was placed up there, as such an offering must be a male, and a gender was there long before it was designated as an offering. Additionally, based on our discussion, it's ruled that animals invalidated as offerings due to use for bestiality would include bird offerings. Further supports for this are brought when it said that some would actually reject blemished offerings from on the altar. Some say this was just the actual practice, others say that it was done so indirectly. We said if the offering was brought down from the altar, it shouldn't be brought back up. This would only apply if it hadn't caught fire. Some say this concept of validity to the altar being gained through catching fire would apply to parts like detached bones, sinew, horns, or hooves. New Mishnah. Now, the following invalid offerings, if brought on the altar, must actually be removed. Meat of Kohanim variant offerings, meat of Kohanim offerings, remainder of Omer offerings, the 2 loaves offerings, the panim bread, the remainder of the mincha offering, and the incense. Regarding wool from the head of lambs, hair from the beard of goats, and bones, sinews, horns, and hooves, if they're attached to the offering, they should be brought up alongside them. If they're separated, they should not, which is based on verses. The Gemara expounds on these sources. Anyways, when it says the horns or sinews and whatnot of offerings are separated from the offering and are removed from the altar, this is where they're being taken down from the pyre. If they're being moved closer towards the pyre, they'd remain on the altar. These detached substances are only really treated as sanctified if they're separated after the blood applications. If they were separated beforehand, they can be used for personal benefit. This is discussed. New Mishnah. If any of the discussed invalid portions are burning on the altar, and then due to the extreme heat they get launched off onto the ground, they should not be returned. Similarly, embers that fall off the temple altar don't need to be returned. Limbs of valid offerings that burst off of the altar, if it's before midnight, they should be returned to the altar and it's forbidden to benefit from them. If it's after midnight, they should not be returned and benefit is permitted. The same way the altar sanctifies whatever is fit for it, the ramp and the sacred vessels do the same. Regarding valid limbs that get launched off the altar, as to whether they're returned, we're discussing limbs that are fully burnt but not yet charcoal. It gives sources for the midnight cutoff by these offerings. If these limbs fell off the altar before midnight and were returned after midnight, it's a debate as to when they're considered to be consumed. Some say the next midnight, some say at dawn. There's related discussion. It also sources the point that the altar, ramp, and service vessels sanctify what's placed on them. Based on this, there's dispute as to whether the actual airspace of the altar has the same status as the altar in regard to sanctifying things and similar. It's disputed, and it winds up unresolved. New Mishnah. Sacred vessels designated for fluids sanctify fluids, and sacred measures for solids sanctify solids, but fluid vessels don't sanctify solids, and solid measures don't sanctify fluids. If a vessel is punctured, it can only sanctify items if it can still sort of be used for its original function, otherwise not. Also, all of these only sanctify items within the actual temple courtyard. The Gemara mentions A basin designated for fluids can also sanctify solids. It debates sources for this. Anyways, it said service vessels can only sanctify while they're whole, when they're full, and only from their interior. Others switch this last one with for being inside the temple courtyard, which creates variation on anything that extends above the brim of a service vessel. It's also said service vessels only sanctify once they're full, but if they're not full and you intend to add more, they sanctify everything that gets added as you go. When we said vessels designated for fluids don't sanctify solids, some say they can sanctify in order to cause invalidation. It also briefly speaks on the maintenance and repair of temple sacred vessels and garments of Kohanim. It speaks on how a number of specific ones of these were made and maintained, and it said that just like the temple offerings, the priestly garments would also atone for sins, for things like known unwarned bloodshed and privately spoken lashon hara, which is gossip. And that's the end of chapter 9. Chapter 10 of Tractate Zevachim continues on the laws of the order of temple offerings. The first Mishnah says, in regards to the order of temple offerings, frequency takes precedence. So the Talmud offering goes before the Musaf offering, the Shabbos Musaf offering goes before the Rosh Chodesh Musaf offering, and the Rosh Chodesh Musaf offering goes before the Rosh Hashanah Musaf offering. This is based on a verse. The Gemara clarifies the scriptural sources for these points. New Mishnah. Another principle that determines the order of bringing temple offerings, whichever is more sacred takes precedence. So the Chatas blood precedes the Ola blood, as Chatas offerings affect atonement. Burning Ola limbs precedes burning Chatas sacrificial parts, as Ola limbs are entirely burnt in the altar fires. A Chatas offering precedes an Asham, as a Chatas' blood is applied to the four horns and the base of the altar. An Asham precedes a Toda and a Nazir's ram offering, as it's a Kachei Kachim type offering. A Toda and Nazir's ram precede Shlamim offerings, as they're eaten for only one day and are brought with loaves of bread. Shlamim offerings precede Bechor offerings, as they require four-sided blood applications, along with Smicha, leaning on the animal, libations, and waving of parts of the animal. The Bechor offering precedes the Ma'aser offering because its sanctity begins from birth and is eaten only by Kohanim. The Ma'aser offering precedes bird offerings as it's a slaughtered offering, and it has Kachei Kachim blood and sacrificial parts. Bird offerings precede Mincha offerings as they're blood offerings. A sinner's Mincha offering precedes a voluntary Mincha offering as it's due to a sin. A bird chatas precedes a bird ola, and this also applied to its consecration. The Gemara quotes sources for the principle that a chatas blood service precedes an ola offering, but vice versa for the actual burning. Regarding procedure between chatas blood and ola limbs, that's disputed, and it's unresolved. Between ola blood and chatas sacrificial parts, that's also unresolved. Between ola blood and asham blood, that's also disputed from a few cases, and is unresolved. It further explains why each individual offering is considered to have a greater level of sanctity than the next, and as to why certain other factors are discounted. It's also said sacrificial parts of Kachei Kalim type offerings that were brought outside the temple courtyard, even before the throwing of the blood, are invalid, and it derives this from other discussion on Ma'aser offerings preceding bird offerings. Additional supports for this are brought. It further explains why each of these offerings take precedence over the other, again as to why certain factors are discounted in either direction. Additional sources are cited. This for the discussion. A case based on all of this, if there's a bird chatas, an animal ola, and a Ma'aser offering, it's argued which takes precedence. Some say slaughter is the overriding factor, so the Ma'aser offering goes first. Others say the bird chatas is elevated above the others and is offered first. New Mishnah. All chatas offerings mentioned in the Torah precede asham offerings, besides for the mitzora leper's asham, as that is what actually purifies a mitzora leper. All asham offerings mentioned in the Torah must be in their second year and worth at least 2 silver shekels, besides for the Nazir and Mitzora's asham, which must be in the first year and can cost less than this. Additionally, besides for all of these discussed having precedence in the order of offering on the altar, they also have precedence in order of consumption. Between a shlamim offering from yesterday and a shlamim offering from today, yesterday's take precedence. Between yesterday's shlamim and today's chatas or asham, it's a dispute. Some say yesterday's shlamim takes precedence. Others say the chatas takes precedence as it's a kachei kachim offering. A related rule, by all these offerings, the Kohanim can vary how they eat them, whether it's roasted, overcooked, cooked. They can add unconsecrated or teruma spices. According to one opinion, others say teruma tithe spices are prohibited in case they get disqualified. The Gemara asks, does frequency or sacredness take precedence? It debates this from a number of laws, from offerings and laws of prayer. It's largely left unresolved. Additionally, it's asked if an uncommon offering was slaughtered before a common offering. It's asked if it should then be offered first, or if it should be held off until the other common one is brought, while keeping its blood stirred so it won't coagulate. This is disputed, and it concludes the uncommon slaughtered offering should have its service completed first. It also sources the principle that the Kohanim can eat these offerings essentially however they want. New Mishnah. It said, if you see oil being distributed to the Kohanim in the temple for consumption, you can presume it's either the remainder of the wafer mincha offerings, or the remainder of the oil of the Mitzorah leper offerings. If oils are being poured on the fires of the altar, you can presume it's from the remainder of the wafer mincha offerings of specifically Kohanim, or the remainder of the mincha offering of an anointed Kohen. There's a dispute if donations of oil were permitted. The Gemara explains in sources the principles of these oil offerings, essentially that a komet sample is burnt on the altar, and the remainder is eaten by the Kohanim. Verses are quoted, and the method of this service is actually disputed. Also, regarding the wine donations, it said it's sprinkled on the altar's fires, which only partially extinguish them, so it's fine. It asserts the fact that fully extinguishing these fires is prohibited. Related, if libations become impure, the Kohanim would make a separate pyre for them on the temple floor, where they're burnt, and it sources this and quotes agreeing opinions. And that's the end of chapter 10. Chapter 11 of Tractate Zevachim continues going through the various laws of temple offerings, now on principles of cleaning garments and vessels. The first Mishnah says, if blood from a chatas offering got splattered on a garment, the garment must be laundered. This would apply by every type of chatas offering, unless the chatas offering was invalid, even if it was valid for a brief period. An example of a chatas that was valid for only a brief period would be one that was left overnight, or it became impure, or it left the courtyard. It would be entirely always invalid if it was slaughtered with improper intent of time or location, or if disqualified people received or threw the blood. The Gemara clarifies, this applies to all chatas offerings, that their blood must be laundered out of garments. It said this would not apply to the bird chatas offering, and it quotes sources. This is discussed. Anyways, it asks what the law is by a bird chatas offering brought inside the temple sanctuary, but before its blood was sprinkled, as to whether that's invalid, based on whether the neck is compared to a service vessel, which would be invalid in such a situation, or that it's compared to the neck of an animal chatas, which would be fine. It's debated from some cases and is unresolved. Similarly, if bird chatas blood spilled onto the floor and was then collected in a vessel, it's argued if this is valid based on whether a service vessel is just not required for that, or that it's actually prohibited. Again, it's a disputed point. Further, if the blood of an animal chatas gets splattered on a garment, and then it goes from the garment to a second garment, it's argued if that second garment requires laundering. Some hold that simply yes, as this blood was valid for a period, so it must be laundered anyways. Additionally, if chatas blood splattered a garment which was impure, thereby making the blood impure, based on whether the blood's invalidation needs to be at a different time from when it contacts the garment, or perhaps you could say that they even can occur simultaneously. This principle is a disputed one based on some laws of impurity regarding a case of sprinkling impure purification waters on a woman with nida impurity. Anyways, we said invalid chatas offering blood in a garment doesn't require laundering. There's a dispute if this applies to an offering that was never valid, or even to one that was valid for a period, and sources are quoted. New Mishnah. If blood of a chatas offering went straight from the animal's neck onto the garment, there's no need to launder it. If it splattered the garment from the horn or base of the altar, there's no need for laundry. If the blood spilled onto the floor and was gathered up, the garment doesn't require laundering. Essentially, the only way the garment would require laundering is if the blood in question was received in a vessel and is fit for sprinkling on the altar. The Gemara quotes sources. It also explains the ending statement of the Mishnah that blood requires laundering if it was received in a service vessel and is otherwise valid, is essentially explaining the reason the prior listed cases don't apply. When it said the blood needs to be fit for sprinkling, that was to exclude a case where he received less than the minimum amount for sprinkling in two separate vessels. The fact that this is invalid is sourced. New Mishnah. If chatas blood splattered on an animal's hide, if the hide wasn't yet stripped from the animal, it doesn't require laundering. If the hide had been stripped, it's a debate. Additionally, by these principles of laundering garments, only the actual spot with blood needs washing, not the full garment. Also, it only applies to something that's susceptible to impurity, and something fit to be laundered, including cloth garments, sackcloth, and hide. The laundering must be done in the temple courtyard. Also, when meat of an offering is cooked in an earthenware vessel, the vessel must be broken in the temple courtyard, and if a copper vessel is used, it must be purged and rinsed in the temple courtyard. Additionally, this principle by a chatas, that its blood must be washed out of garments, is a stringency that applies to the chatas specifically over other kachei kachim type offerings. The Gemara quotes sources for these principles. These are additionally discussed. Also, when it said that something that can be laundered applies by these laws, that's to exclude something like vessels. We give examples of cloth garments, sackcloth, and hide. There's a dispute if leather would apply. Some say everybody agrees soft leathers are launderable, while hard leathers are disputed. That's discussed. There's a dispute on this based on what exactly the parameters of laundering are defined as. It also sources the principle that laundering these garments and the cleaning of vessels for offerings were all done within the actual temple courtyard. New Mishnah. If a garment that was stained with chatas blood went outside the temple courtyard, it should be brought back inside and laundered. If it became impure while outside, it should be torn to remove its impurity status, and then brought back inside and laundered. If an earthenware vessel that was used to cook a chatas offering went outside the temple courtyard, it should be brought back inside and broken. If it became impure while outside, it should be punctured to remove its impurity status, and brought back inside and broken. If a copper vessel that was used to cook a chatas offering went outside the temple courtyard, it should be brought back inside and purged and rinsed. If it became impure while outside, it should have a large hole knocked out to remove its impurity status and brought back inside and purged and rinsed. The Gemara clarifies when the garment is being torn, it doesn't mean in two. It means across majority of its length or width, so that way it's still valid to be laundered. This is sufficient biblically. When the earthenware vessel is being punctured, that's referring to a hole the size of a small root, so that way it could still be broken as an actual vessel. When we said the copper utensil needs a hole knocked inside, it then has that hole hammered shut, so that way it's valid to be rinsed and purged afterwards. If the garment in question is the robe of the Kohen Gadol, which cannot be ripped, it should be brought into the courtyard 3 finger breadths at a time, and it should be laundered as it goes in. Additionally, it's asked, as urine was one of the types of detergent used back in those days, how could that be used within the temple courtyard? So it's explained that the urine in this case was mixed with tasteless saliva, as was each type of detergent. New Mishnah. Regarding the cooking of offerings, whether it was cooked in a pot or if it had just had hot liquid poured over it, whether it was kache kachim or kache kalim type offerings, the pots used must be purged and then rinsed. Others hold the pots used to cook kache kalim don't need purging and rinsing. The Gemara quotes sources. It's asked, what if the chatas was suspended in an oven without touching the walls? Is just absorption considered a concern? It argues this from a number of brought cases discussing a number of unique types of ovens. These are spoken on further. Specific incidents involving purging and cleaning these utensils are quoted. Sources are brought for the remaining points. It's said that teruma in a pot does not require purging or rinsing in spite of the flavor absorption. It's clarified that the entire pot doesn't need purging, but the actual place of cooking does. Others say that it actually all must be purged, but you can even use wine or diluted wine. Others say it's just that purging can even be done with hot water alone, with no additional cold rinsing needed. New Mishnah, Rabbi Tarfon says, if somebody cooked meat of an offering in a vessel at the beginning of a holiday, he can continue cooking it across the entire holiday. The sages say that until the time of eating is the requirement for purging and rinsing, which will be explained. Purging and rinsing must be done the same way that cup by blessings after meals are prepared, that it should be washed on the inside and outside here, both with cold water. A spit or a grill are purged with hot water. The Gemara quotes sources for the opinions of Rabbi Tarfon and the sages. There's a dispute as to how purging and rinsing are done. Some say both are done with cold water after a hot water purging. Some say purging is done with hot water and rinsing is done with cold water. They debate sources. New Mishnah. If somebody cooks sacrificial meats and regular meats together in a pot, or kache kachim meats were cooked with kache kalim meats, if there's enough that the more stringent type of meat will impart flavor to the other, then the other more lenient type of meat must be eaten in the same manner as the stricter piece, and the pot doesn't require purging and rinsing, and other foods aren't disqualified through their contact. If a disqualified mincha wafer offering touched a regular qualified mincha wafer, or a slice of disqualified sacrificial meat touched a proper slice of qualified meat, neither would be entirely disqualified. The only forbidden place is the place of contact and absorption. The Gemara clarifies in the first case, if the two meats touch each other, if there's enough to transfer flavors, the lenient meat is eaten like the stringent one is, the pots require purging and rinsing, and they disqualify other foods through contact. If there's not enough to transfer flavor, none of these apply. Some clarify that the pot with kache kalim would require purging and rinsing. It's just not required by kache kachim. Others say it's just not required by kache kalim. That's qualified. It also quotes related conversation on the two types of wafer offerings coming in contact. Anyway, it's clearly the positive commandment to eat offering meat is not overriding the negative commandment to not eat disqualified meats. There are a few suggested reasons why. Some say that a positive commandment does not override a negative commandment by the temple. Others say that it says positive commandments can't override a combination of a positive and negative commandment. It's discussed. Sources are quoted along with related points. Anyways, it's said if blood of a chatas and an ola splatter on a garment, if the chatas blood is on bottom, the garment must be laundered. But if the ola blood is on bottom, it said laundering is not required here. It's also said if there's blood on a garment, it will create an interposition if placed in a mikvah. Well, this would not apply if the garment owner was a slaughterer, as presumably he's fine with the blood. Similarly, if there's grease on a garment, it will create an interposition if placed in a mikvah, while this would not apply if the garment owner sold grease by the same principle. Now, if there's blood and grease on a garment and the garment owner is a slaughterer and he sells grease, is a debate as to if he'll take issue with both of these substances, and that stands unresolved. And that's the end of chapter 11. Chapter 12 of Tractate Zevachim covers the laws of the portion of temple offerings that were eaten by the Kohanim. The first Mishnah says, a Kohen who is impure and immersed, but the day hasn't ended yet, which is a necessary step of the purification process, or somebody who's impure and hasn't yet brought his necessary offerings, they don't get a share of the offerings in the temple that were eaten by Kohanim. A Kohen who is mourning the passing of a close relative is allowed to touch offerings as he's not impure, but he cannot eat of them and he doesn't receive a share. A Kohen with a blemish, whether it's temporary or permanent, he can have a share and eat of offerings, but he cannot offer them himself. Generally, if a Kohen is not eligible to perform the offering service, they don't have a share of the meat, and if they do not have a share of the meat, they don't get a share of the hides. If a Kohen was impure when the blood was thrown, but pure when the fats were burned, he would not get a share of the meat, which is based on a verse. The Gemara quotes the scriptural source for this concept, that a Kohen who immersed but hasn't waited until the day to end, that he cannot eat of temple offerings. It's asked, what if a Kohen has a blemish, and is also impure as he's blemished, so he's not eligible to perform the service, but he still gets a share of the offering. So perhaps the fact that he's impure creates no variation. It's asked that as he cannot eat of the offerings since he's impure, he gets no share in them. The same applies to impure Kohanim by communal offerings. Anyways, regarding a mourner, we said he can touch the sacrificial food. However, in an earlier tractate, Chagiga, on page 21a, we said a mourner cannot touch sacrificial foods. The difference is explained to be that by the other Mishnah, the man took care to not become biblically impure, but he still became rabbinically impure, unlike here, which we prove is a possibility. Alternatively, it's just that the other Mishnah refers to eating the sacrificial foods, while ours refers to just touching them. Additionally, by a mourner, our Mishnah said that he cannot claim his own share, but it implies that he can share the portions of other Kohanim. However, in Tractate Pesachim, by the laws of the Paschal offering, it says a mourner cannot share of others' offerings, so it's explained that as the mourner can eat the Paschal offering himself on the night of Passover, at that point he can eat all types of offerings, while he wouldn't be able to do this the rest of the year. Alternatively, the difference is on when his relative died, as when he's allowed to eat the offering, it's when his relative died and was buried on the 13th, the day before Passover, while our source talks about passing and burial on the 14th. This would holds that the mourning period doesn't extend to the following night, which it then sources. That's qualified further. There's additional discussion on these principles. This goes on further on concepts of a mourner and the consumption of the Paschal offering, based on where exactly the period of mourning extends to, be it biblically or rabbinically. It brings up the incident with Nadav and Avihu, as apparently Aaron and his sons were told to eat offerings in spite of their period of mourning. It's a debate if the prohibition here was waived. It's additionally discussed along with several verses on this topic. Some hold that the Rosh Chodesh Chatas offering brought by that incident was actually burned instead of being eaten, and it's debated as to the exact circumstance. There's also related debate as to whether Moshe himself was a Kohen or not. This is discussed quoting many incidents throughout scripture that imply either way. It also quotes the verse, and he left Pharaoh's presence in a burning anger, which it says is in reference to the fact that Moshe slapped Pharaoh across the face at this point. Others say he actually was more respectful, as it's held that royalty should always be treated with respect. It's argued as whether Moshe himself was considered to be a king. It's said that a Kohen with a blemish, be it temporary or permanent, still gets a share and can eat of the temple offerings. The sources for this are quoted. Anyways, it had stated that a Kohen who is not eligible to bring an offering cannot eat of the offerings. However, we said a blemished Kohen who is ineligible to bring an offering can eat of the offerings. Also, an impure Kohen is eligible to perform the offering service, but he cannot eat of them. So it's explained that by the impure person, it didn't actually state that an impure person does get a share, and by the blemished Kohen, that's just specified as an exception. We said that if somebody was impure when the blood was thrown and pure when the fat was burned, he does not get a share of the offering. This seemingly would imply that if he was pure when the blood was thrown and impure when the fat was burned, he would get a share, but many dispute this. If the Kohen was pure when the blood was thrown and the fats were burned, but was briefly impure in between, that stands unresolved. The remaining principles are sourced. New Mishnah. If the Olah offering is at the point that the altar would not receive the meat, the Kohanim do not receive the hides of the animal. If an Olah was slaughtered not for its own sake, it doesn't fulfill anything for its owner, but the hide would nevertheless go to the Kohanim. The hides of the Olah of a man or woman go to the Kohanim. The hides of Kachei Kalim type offerings go to their owners. The hides of Kachei Kachim type offerings go to the Kohanim, as they also acquire the meat. The Gemara additionally quotes sources for these principles. There are various opinions on these, and they're discussed further at length. New Mishnah. By all temple offerings, if they were invalidated prior to being skinned, the Kohanim don't receive their hides. If the invalidation occurred after they were skinned, the Kohanim would receive the hides. The administrator of the Kohanim testified that he had never seen a hide invalidated and disposed of, so it's a debate if a Bechor offering is skinned and is found to have a defect, if in that case its hide can be kept or it must be taken to the place of burning. The Gemara says the prior Mishnah seemingly contradicts ours, saying that if the meat is disqualified, the hide cannot be kept. This is in accordance with a differing opinion that holds that the permissibility of the hide depends entirely on the meat's acceptance. So it's explained either that skinning typically took place after the blood service, Or here, it means that once the hide has been made fit by the blood service, it can no longer be invalidated. It debates between these opinions from additional discussions. In the end, it's held that the law accords with the opinion that if offering meat is discovered to have a defect afterwards, the hide must be disposed of by burning while the meat is buried. New Mishnah. The burned bull and burned he-goat offerings, which were variants of the chatas, were burned in the place of ashes, and they contaminate impurity towards garments. If they're not being burned according to proper procedure, they're burned in the temple and they don't contaminate impurity. They would be carried on poles, and it's a debate as to when during the carrying process, or possibly in the burning process, people's garments would become impure. The Gemara defines these places of ashes and gives their locations, along with some of the services that use them. Regarding these burned bull and he-goat offerings, it's a dispute of keeping them overnight would disqualify them. That's disputed from a few sources. It's also asked whether removing them from the temple courtyard disqualifies them, which it disputes, along with a case of parts of the animal leaving the courtyard. There are several unresolved points on this. The principles of impurity are also sourced by these particular offerings and others. It discusses points on how something like a regular kosher bird carcass would give off impurity, and similar regarding other animal carcasses. The remaining principles from the Mishnah are sourced. These are additionally discussed. And that's the end of chapter 12. Chapter 13 of Tractate Zevachim begins covering the laws of the exact permissible locations of temple offerings. The first Mishnah says, the only place that it was permissible to perform sacrificial offerings was in the temple in Jerusalem, when it stands. If somebody slaughtered and offered animals outside of the temple, he's liable for both the slaughter and the offering. Rabbi Yossi Aglili holds, if somebody slaughtered the animal inside and offered it outside, he's liable, but if he slaughtered it outside and offered it outside, he's actually not liable, as he only offered an invalid offering. The sages say, if somebody slaughtered the animal inside and then takes it outside to be offered, he's not liable, as he invalidated the offering just by taking it outside. A similar dispute, instead of somebody who's impure eats impure sacrificial foods, or somebody impure eats regular sacrificial foods, he's liable. Rabbi Yossi Aglili would say that if he was impure and ate impure foods, he's not liable, as he only ate just an impure food with no other level of sanctity. The sages would say that even if he was impure and ate a pure sacrificial food, he touched it and made it impure, so he's only eating impure food. Anyways, somebody who's pure who eats an impure food is not liable, as the only liability there is for impurity of the body. The Gemara quotes the scriptural sources for these principles. There are a few opinions as to where exactly it's derived from, and they dispute. And this is to source all aspects of this prohibition against offering the animal outside, against offering an animal slaughtered outside, etc. It also sources a point that will be discussed later, that throwing parts of the offering blood outside the temple is forbidden. This is discussed, although some hold that there's no liability for performing melika, the slaughter of a bird offering, outside the temple, which is sourced. Additionally, it sources the principle that performing kemitza, the handful of the flour offering, outside the temple is forbidden. Anyways, it spent some time defining exactly what constitutes outside the temple complex. For one thing, it said slaughtering kachei kachim variant offerings in the southern part of the temple courtyard, while not permissible, had no punishment for doing so, as slaughtering kachei kalim type offerings in that location was permitted. So slaughtering on the actual roof of the temple would be forbidden, as no offering is permitted to be slaughtered there. It disputes on the source for this. Anyways, it's asked, as of currently, where there is no temple, is there liability for making an offering outside the temple area? Some say yes, as the sanctification of the temple area is permanent. Others disagree, saying it's not. This is disputed by other opinions. Similarly, if somebody offers an offering outside the temple, but in less than the minimum volume of an olive, but there's a bone attached that brings it over the minimum size, it's a dispute if there's liability based on if attachments to the offering are considered likely offerings themselves. It's also asked what if there's a pigeon head brought that's under the minimum size of an olive, but it has salt on it that brings it over the minimum size. This is different than the prior case, as on one hand, the salt is not a part of the actual meat, but on the other hand, the salt is a requirement for the altar. That remains unresolved. Rabbi Yossi Aglili had said that there's only no liability if somebody slaughtered the offering and offered it outside, as he's just offering something invalid. The sages disputed this, saying that he's even not valid if he slaughtered it inside, as when he brings the animal outside the temple, it becomes invalid. Rabbi Yossi Aglili would respond to this, either by saying it's different, as this offering was permitted for a period. Alternatively, it's different, as learned in earlier chapters, that if it was slaughtered outside, the sanctity of the altar can still affect acceptance of it. There's a practical difference between these by an animal slaughtered at night, or if the blood was received in an unconsecrated vessel. The principles by impurity and sacrificial meat are additionally discussed. New Mishnah. There's a stringency against slaughtering an animal outside the temple over offering it outside, as if somebody slaughters for a regular person, he's liable, but if somebody offers the animal to a regular person, he's not liable. There's a stringency against offering an animal outside the temple over slaughtering it outside, as if two people simultaneously slaughter an animal, they're not liable, while if two people simultaneously offer the animal, they would be liable. liable. If somebody impermissibly offered an animal and then did so again and again, it's a dispute. Some say he's liable each time, others say he's only liable once. Also, some say there's only liability for offering an animal outside the temple if this is done on an actual altar. Others say it's even forbidden if it's done on a rock or a stone. The Gemara explains the difference between slaughtering for and offering to a regular person is based on a verse. These principles are additionally sourced. Anyways, by the case of somebody offering an animal over and over again, there was a dispute as to if he's liable for each one of these or only once. There are a few opinions as to what this case is exactly. Some say it's where he's offering several different limbs of a single offering, meaning there's definitely liability for offering a single limb. Others say it's discussing offering a single limb of an offering, meaning there's definitely liability for offering several limbs. Others say the dispute is by invalid offerings that became incomplete and were offered outside. Alternatively, they agree there's no liability for that, and they dispute valid offerings that became incomplete and were offered outside. It sources all these opinions along with the remaining points. New Mishnah, there's liability for offering animals out to the temple if they're valid or were invalidated in the temple. Also, if somebody offers an olive's volume of an ola offering and its sacrificial parts outside the temple, he's liable. The Gemara lengthily sources these principles. Anyways, as it specifies that there's liability for offering an ola and its sacrificial parts outside the temple, it implies that this would not apply by a shalomim offering, as seen in other sources. That's disputed. There are further points. New Mishnah. Further regarding offerings outside the temple, the kaimetz handful of the mincha offering, the frankincense, the incense, the mincha offering of Kohanim, the mincha of the anointed Kohen, a libation mincha. If there's an olive's volume minimum of these outside the temple, some say you're liable, others say you're only liable for offering the entire offering. Also, by all of these, if they were offered inside the temple and then a portion was left over and somebody offered them outside the temple, he's liable. If any of these offerings were reduced at all and offered outside the temple, there's no liability. Related, if somebody offers an animal's sacrificial meats and sacrificial parts outside, he's liable for the latter. The Gemara says, related, if somebody burns an olive's volume of incense outside the temple, he's liable, but if he burns a pras, which was a measurement inside, the community is exempt from offering anymore. There's a dispute as to what exactly that's referring to. This is discussed further. We said if these listed offerings were reduced, there's no liability for offering them outside. It's asked as to whether the same would apply if the reduction occurred outside the actual temple. That's argued on from a few cases, along with the remaining points. New Mishnah, if somebody offered a mincha offering, which hadn't had its kamitza handful removed outside the temple, there's no liability. If somebody removed the kamitza handful and then added it back and offered it outside the temple, he is liable. The Gemara explains, based on a comparison, that the remainder of the mincha offering does not nullify the kaimetz handful. New Mishnah, if one of the kaimetz handfuls or frankincense of the mincha offering are offered outside the temple, there's liability. Others say there's only liability if both of these are offered outside. It's agreed if one is offered fully inside and one is offered fully outside, there's liability. Similarly, if the 2 spoons of frankincense for the showbread have one offered outside the temple, some say he's liable, others say there's only liability if both are fully offered outside. It's agreed if one is fully offered inside and the other is fully offered outside, there's liability. The Gemara asks, is it possible if somebody burns a kaimetz handful on the altar and then retroactively separates a portion of the mincha offering to have the kaimetz being burnt for, if that's permissible or not, which is unresolved. New Mishnah, if somebody throws sacrificial bloods outside the temple, he's liable. Also, some say there's liability on sukkahs for pouring a water libation outside the temple. Some say there's liability for pouring blood remnants outside the temple. The Gemara says it's agreed by these opinions that throwing the sacrificial blood outside the temple, he's liable. It sources the principle that water libations outside the temple on sukkahs are prohibited. It's disputed as to what amounts create a liability. Some say 3 lugin of water, others say there's a maximum limit and say it's within a vessel. Others say they disputed whether libations were offered in the wilderness. Others say the dispute is if water libations are derived from wine libations. There's similar dispute quoted elsewhere. It also sources the opinion for liability by offering blood remnants outside the temple. This is as he holds the blood remnants are essential. New Mishnah, if somebody slaughtered a bird offering inside the temple with milika and then offered it outside, he's liable. If he did milika outside and then offered it outside, he's not liable. If somebody slaughtered a bird with a knife inside the temple, which is not how it's done, and offered it outside, he's not liable. If he slaughtered the bird with a knife outside the temple and offered it outside, he's liable. So we see making a bird valid by doing malika inside the temple exempts it outside, and making a bird valid outside the temple by slaughtering it with a knife makes it exempt inside the temple. Others disagree and say that any offering that has liability when it was slaughtered outside, there's also liability for doing the same procedure inside and then offering it outside. The exception would be by slaughtering the bird with a knife inside and offering it outside. The Gemara clarifies the wording and argues as to what exactly this dissenting opinion is referring to. It's explained to be possibly in accordance with several of the Mishnah's listed cases. New Mishnah, if somebody received a chatas's blood in a single cup, and some was applied to the altar inside the temple and some was applied outside, he is liable, as all of it was fit to be offered in the temple. If he received the blood in 2 cups and both were applied inside, that's permissible. If both were applied outside, he's liable. If one was applied inside and one was applied outside, he's liable for applying one cup outside, and then the other cup atones for him. This is comparable to somebody who designated an animal as a chatas offering and then loses it, so he designates a replacement animal, and then he finds the original. So if both are slaughtered inside the temple, that's fine. If both are slaughtered outside, he's liable. And if one was slaughtered outside and one was slaughtered inside, he's liable for the one outside, and the other offering atones for him. Related by the two chatas offerings offered inside, the blood of the first chatas exempts the meat of both offerings from prohibitions against benefit. The Gemara explains who this follows in accordance with individually held opinions. Anyways, by the case of the two chatas animals where one was lost, it said this was comparable to the former case to show that if the circumstance was that the second male chatas, which in this case had to be a goat of the Nasi, was designated as a guarantee for the other, one of them was definitely going to be consigned to grazing and become an ola offering, meaning it doesn't become invalid when the other is slaughtered, meaning somebody who slaughters it outside will be liable. That's sourced. And that's the end of chapter 13. Chapter 14, the final chapter of Tractate Zevachim, finishes the laws of temple animal offerings and further on prohibitions against bringing offerings outside the temple. The first Mishnah says, if a red heifer cow or the Yom Kippur Azazel he-goat offering, which are offered outside the temple, are offered outside the temple but in the incorrect location, there is no liability. Further, if an offering was offered outside the temple but it had been made invalid through being used for bestiality, it had been designated for worship or worshipped as an idol, it had been exchanged for a dog or paid to a harlot, or was a crossbreed, or had a defect, or was born via C-section, it's invalid anyways, so there's no liability for bringing it outside the temple. An animal with any sort of blemish, some say there's no liability for offering it outside the temple. Rabbi Shimon says there is liability if it had a temporary blemish. For bird offerings, if the turtle dove is too young or the pigeon is too old, there's no liability if brought outside the temple. Rabbi Shimon says there is liability if there was a young turtle dove. For an animal and its offspring at the same time, or a premature offering, that's a debate. The latter opinion of Rabbi Shimon holds that anything fit to be brought as an offering in the future, there's liability for offering it outside the temple, and the other sages disagree. A premature offering, as mentioned, could either be that the offering itself is too young, or it's that the offering must be brought in a specific time and it's just too early, such as by offerings for certain impurities, a leper, and similar. Anyways, offering the actual meat of a chatas or asham, or any meat of a kache kachim or kache kalam variant, or the remainder of the Omer offering, or the 2 loaves, or the showbread, or the remainder of the mincha offering, or doing the actual steps of the mincha offering, pouring oil, breaking it up, mixing it, salting it, waving it, etc., or putting the actual showbread on the shulchan, or preparing the menorah lamps, or removing the kometz handful from the mincha offering, or receiving the blood of an animal in a vessel. There's no liability for doing any of those outside the temple. There's also no liability for doing any of those in general as a non-Kohen, while impure, while not wearing the priestly garments, or doing them without having washed one's hands or feet. However, besides for all of this, there were some unique periods in history when making offerings outside of the temple or the tabernacle was uniquely permitted. This was allowed before the building of the tabernacle in the desert, wherein the offering service was done by the firstborn, as opposed to the Kohanim. That only started after the building of the tabernacle. Kachim offerings had to be eaten inside the actual tabernacle, and kalam offerings would be eaten in the camp. When the Jewish people came to Gilgal, offerings outside the temple became permitted again. Kachim offerings were eaten in the temple, and kalam offerings were eaten anywhere. The tabernacle was rebuilt at Shiloh, and outside offerings were again prohibited. Kachim were eaten within, and kalam and ma'aser sheni tithes were eaten within sight of the tabernacle. Then in Nov and Gibeon, offerings outside the temple were again allowed. Kachim were eaten within these sanctuaries, and kalam could be eaten anywhere in Israel. Then when they arrived in Jerusalem, these outside offerings were permanently forbidden as the temple was built, and kachim offerings were eaten within, and kalam and ma'aser sheni could be eaten within Jerusalem. If an offering was consecrated and offered during a period where outside offerings were forbidden, there's 2 prohibitions violated and a penalty of kares, divine punishment. If an offering was consecrated when outside offerings were allowed but offered when they were forbidden, there's 2 prohibitions violated and no penalty of kares. If the offering was consecrated when outside offerings were forbidden and offered when they were allowed, there's only a single prohibition violated. Even when outside offerings were permitted, there were some specific types that still had to be brought at the actual tabernacle. These were communal offerings and offerings consecrated specifically to the tabernacle, although there was no liability by the latter one if they were brought outside. There were also private and communal outside altars. The difference was that a communal outside altar required simicha, leaning on the offering. It had to be slaughtered on the north side. The application of the blood around was required. It had to be waved. Some say the mincha offering had to be brought by the southwest corner, although others just say there were no mincha offerings brought by these. Anyways, on things done by a communal outside altar further, they had to wear priestly garments, they had to use service vessels, the ola couldn't be roasted before being burnt for its aroma. A line was drawn to designate upper and lower blood sprinkling, and they had to wash their hands and feet. By both private and communal outside offerings, they would be invalidated if brought after its proper time, if it was leftover, or if the eater was impure. The Gemara debates as to where exactly this red heifer is being offered that's invalid for it. Some suggest within the actual walls of Jerusalem. Others say it's being done not opposite the temple entrance. This debate is principally on whether there's a concern of impurity across the land of Israel, as to whether there's concern of bits of bones and corpses being embedded under the earth from the flood, like it exists by the rest of the world, as to if the flood reached the land of Israel. That's disputed from a number of verses. It argues on this. According to the opinion that the flood didn't reach Israel, it said everybody nevertheless died within due to the extreme heat, besides for possibly the Re'im creature, which was some sort of immense beast, although others say its cubs were brought in the ark. It mentions that the waters around the ark were cooled, which is why the pitch on the ark didn't dissolve, and it's where Og, king of Bashan, held on, as he was the sole survivor of the giants. It's also said that Babylonia, also called Shinar, is called such as all the dead sank there. Anyways, it debates from a different source as to whether the he-goat of Azazel can be offered anywhere outside. It said our source refers specifically to where it's after it was selected by the law and after the confession was recited. Anyways, it sources the prohibitions for the remaining points against an animal being used for bestiality or a mixed breed or one being born via C-section, etc. Anyways, Rabbi Shimon specified his opinion several times by temporarily blemished animals as they're considered repulsive offerings, by premature turtle doves as they're not considered repulsive, and by an animal and its offspring as it was originally valid and became rejected. So he's saying he maintains his opinion in all these cases. It also sources his logic. A few verses are quoted and suggested. It also qualifies the remaining prohibited or permitted specific offerings, bringing up additional specific types and variants. There's essentially a dispute as to whether there's liability for slaughtering a premature Asham offering, not for its own sake, outside the temple. That's disputed from a few cases. It additionally sources the remaining points, also going through the steps of the offerings as they were done with the tabernacle. There are additional points on the forbidden offerings of Nadav and Avihu, and it also speaks on the importance of accepting God's judgment with happiness, which is related to that whole event, saying there's great reward for doing so. It's mentioned that animals offered before the tabernacle was built had to be animals that would in the future be designated as kosher, which was known by Noah, as kosher animals entered the ark in multiples of 7s, while non-kosher animals were in multiples of 2. It sources opinions by the remaining discussed types of offerings as to which ones were offered by non-Jewish people. There's a related dispute as to whether Yisro or Jethro joined the Jewish people in the desert before or after the giving of the Torah. That's disputed from a few sources. It's also said that non-Jewish people nowadays are permitted to make offerings outside the temple, which it sources and quotes a few incidents of this occurring. It also defines the area of the tabernacle and describes the arrangement of the camps in Jerusalem and in Shiloh. It further explains what kinds of offerings could be brought on a communal outside altar when it was permitted. It disputes this from the Nazir's offerings and related. The remaining principles from the Mishnah as to the proper service by private and communal outside altars are sourced. There are various opinions. Some say the only difference between a major and minor outside altar is that a paschal offering and obligatory offering with a set time can be brought on the major one. That's disputed. It additionally sources the principles regarding where each type of offering could be eaten around the tabernacle at Shiloh, and it argues if the territory of Shiloh itself was in the portion of Ephraim or Binyamin. That's discussed. It also spent some time making calculations and giving the exact length of time each of these tabernacles stood for. The tabernacle in the desert stood for 39 years, the one in Gilgal stood for 14 years, and the one in Nov and Gibeon stood for 57 years. It additionally sources principles as to when each of these outside tabernacles became permitted, along with some related points. It also disputes what scriptural words exactly are used in reference to the tabernacle at Shiloh. It additionally proves we hold that an offering consecrated when outside altars were allowed and offered when they're prohibited has no penalty of kares. Additional sources are cited. Related, it said if you held that mincha offerings were done on outside altars, you'd also hold that bird offerings were allowed, otherwise not. Further sources from scripture are quoted. There are a few additional unresolved points. Anyways, by an offering slaughtered at nighttime by a private outside altar, that's a dispute based on verses if it's allowed or not. Also, by an olah, by a private outside altar, it's disputed if it needs to be skinned and dismembered or not. That's argued from sources. Anyways, it sources the remaining listed principles. Specifically, it proves a verse is necessary to state that being at the wrong time is an invalidating factor by the major outside altar, and the same is a concern by a minor one. And that's the end of chapter 14 and the entire Tractate Zevachim. Alright, that was a lot of information, so here's a rough summary of a lot of the practical takeaways from this tractate. As listed throughout scripture, primarily in the book of Vayikra, Leviticus, there were many offerings called karbanis brought in the temple in Jerusalem and in the tabernacle. There were offerings brought for committing sins, like the Chatas offering. There were offerings given out of thanks, like the Todah offering. There were offerings given on holidays, like the Paschal offering, and many, many others. They were typically animals like bulls, sheep, or goats, although there were some bird offerings, some wine or water libations, and as will be discussed in the following tractate, types of flour offerings. Each of these offerings had a particular process to be brought on the temple altar. It typically involved slaughtering the animal, receiving its blood in a vessel, and applying it to the altar, burning parts of the animal on the altar, and in some cases eating parts of the meat. As for who could perform each of these steps, how they were done, where they were done, when they were done, and similar, that's discussed throughout. Naturally, this has little practical application without a temple, although we do read about these offerings every day in prayer, and they will resume with the coming of Mashiach and the rebuilding of the third temple. And that's about everything. Thank you so much for watching.